Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my 2026 LCK Cup Primer and Power Rankings video. We are back in the LCK. We are starting up in just a couple of days as this video is going live with the LCK Cup, the Winter Split, whatever you want to call it, split number 1 here in the LCK. This format actually kind of surprised me in a positive way. Last year, I was pretty interested by the way things ended up playing out, and I think this year the format ends up being even better. They've kind of fine-tuned some of the problems from last year, and I think the groups are a little bit more balanced, which makes me more excited for what the LCK is going to look like at the start of this year, not to mention all of the roster changes and just all of the fun news coming out of the offseason. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you expect from the LCK over the course of this year? And are there teams that, we're going to go through in today's video? I'm going to be ranking everybody, every team, every single player within their position. We'll talk about that just a bit more, the format, in just a couple of moments. But are there any teams or players that you think I'm ranking too high, that you think I'm ranking too low? Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions on everything. I, of course, never claim to be the only opinion out there, but, if you have something that you disagree with, please let me know down in the comments. It's always really interesting to hear the feedback from you guys, especially. I know there are a lot of people that have been waiting for the LCK version of this video. We did release the LPL version of this video just 2 days ago. You can check that out up in the iCard if you are interested. We also graded every single team's offseason about a month or so ago after all of the changes got announced. You can check out that video as well. This is definitely going to be a different kind of video. I was very quick to specify the player grades, making sure to give everybody a letter grade and kind of talking about the offseason, whether or not I think teams are moving in the right or wrong direction. That's what that video was for. This video is entirely predicated on how I think these teams are going to perform right now. Do I think they're good? Do I think they're bad? Do I think they're better or worse than their competition? And how do I think that relays itself to the rest of the LCK? It's not really about outlook. It's not really about, I think this team could be interesting if these players develop. It's, do I think that these teams are interesting at the moment? And that's why I'm really excited to make this. It's why it's a lot of people's favorite video over the course of the year, especially at the beginning of the year. So let's get into the format that you are going to see. What we're going to do in today's video is go from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings for the LCK teams, talking about everything you need to know about these teams, about these players. I'll be ranking every single team, like I said, power ranking style, and I'll also be ranking every single player within their individual role from number 1 to number 10. We'll be talking about whether or not I think teams got better or worse from where I had them in the summer split last year. You'll see that a little bit more obviously in the graphics, and I'll kind of talk about what that means for the groups in general. If you're not familiar with the LCK Cup format, the way that this works is the 10 teams got separated into 2 groups of 5. Every single team will play a single round robin against every team in the other group. I think that's the easiest way to put it. So if you're in group BRION, you're going to play a single round robin against the 5 teams in group Elder. And then from there, that's how the league is going to go ahead and seed the playoffs for the winter split. The groups will be split into a winners group and a losers group, depending on which group ends up performing better, who wins more games. The top 2 teams from the winners group and then the top team from the losers group will immediately be slotted in as the top 3 seeds going into playoffs. I believe the top 2 teams from winners group are always the top 2 seeds, regardless of record. And then the top team from losers group, I believe, is always the 3 seed going into playoffs, but it could be a little bit up in the air, kind of depending on how things go. The bottom 3 teams, or the final 3 teams from winners group, and then I believe 2nd through 4th of losers group then play in the play-in stage to determine the final 3 teams to make the 6-team playoff. It's a bit of a complicated format, but a couple of notable changes from last year. Instead of it being the top 3 teams from the winners group, it's top 2 and then top 1 from losers group. That should hopefully help kind of negate what essentially happened last year, which is the fact that there were some pretty good teams on the other side of a group split that ended up really kind of getting screwed because the rest of their group wasn't very good. T1 was kind of the primary example of that. KT Rolster ended up stealing a 3 seed despite being a below 500 team because they were just in the winners group with 2 other really good teams in Gen.G, and I believe it was Dplus KIA at the same time as the top 2 seeds. So just ended up being kind of funny how that ended up working out. This is definitely a better way to do the LCK Cup, and I'll talk about it now. The groups last year were not very balanced. I called that out very quickly in my primer video. That was a bit of an against the grain opinion, but it turned out to be almost entirely accurate. This year, I think the groups are almost perfectly balanced, so I'm excited to see how that ends up breaking down, but that is the format for the winter split for those of you who are unfamiliar, and that's why I think it's important to talk about whether or not I think teams are good or bad within the essence of their group, because it could really matter if bottom team teams end up overperforming and beating some teams they're not supposed to, because that could get your group into winners group and guarantee you a spot in the play-in stage. So that's why I think it's worth bringing up, but still just going to talk about the league as a whole, like I said, from number 10 to number 1. Some caveats at the beginning, as I always have to say in videos like this. First and foremost, it's just my opinion. There are going to be a lot of people out there that get really mad that I have a player too low or too high or something like that, that really get frustrated with some of my opinions. I'll preface the people who have maybe not been around the channel for quite a while right now. I am not the most consensus analyst out there. In fact, I think I've generated a bit of a reputation on this channel for being against the grain on certain opinions and really sticking to my guns. It's because I really believe them, and a lot of those takes have worked out for me. It doesn't mean they work out 100% of the time, but they certainly work out more than they miss, and, you know, I'm excited to go over some of the takes that I have in this video that are definitely not, you know, public opinion or you know, kind of against the grain. There are certain players especially that I don't like as much as the consensus does, but feel free to let me know down in the comments. As long as you're respectful with the comment, I'm not going to, you know, worry too much. I love dissenting opinions. I love knowing where I'm with and against the community, because I don't always get a really good idea of exactly where everybody stands. So let me know down in the comments. And then alongside that, you know, treat this scale very flexibly. Yes, I'm ranking every single player in this video, and I'm going to be talking about all of them, you know, in comparison to, you know, people in their position, but not every number on this screen is the end all be all. There are going to be some players that, you know, basically have identical grades for me, but because it's a ranking, one has to be above the other, and there are going to be very minor differences. You can basically move anybody up 1 or 2 spots or down 1 or 2 spots, and it's not really all that different from the opinion that I have. If you have a player at number 6 in their position and I have them at number 5 or number 4, we're probably not all that, you know, dissimilar in terms of where we think and feel about that player. So definitely kind of keep that in mind. It's definitely meant to be more flexible. And also, you guys should know this, but not every position is created equally. The number 5 player in mid lane is going to be better than the number 5 player in, you know, support. It's just is the way that it is in the LCK. Some positions are just stronger than others. You can't just look at a number and say, oh, well, another player who has that same number is equally as good or has the same grade. It's obviously a lot more flexible than that. So that's the big preamble out of the way. We're 7 minutes in. If you are new, this is a podcast. Stick around. It's going to be more than an hour. I don't know how long this video ends up being, but it's definitely going to be a long one. So strap in and let's get into our first team that we get to talk about in today's video. Like I've said a couple of times, we're going from number 10 to number 1, reverse order in my power ranking. So we're starting with the team that I think is the worst right now in the LCK, the team that I'm expecting to do the worst at the very least in the winter split. And maybe some people are going to be surprised by this, but for me, coming in at number 10, it is going to be DRX, an organization that has really struggled to find its footing over the past couple of years, and I do not think they're moving in the right direction with a lot of the moves that they've made. I've already received some comments on my off-season grades video that I'm quote-unquote too low on, you know, 1 or 2 of these players, and I'm going to stick to my guns. I think right now this is the worst team in the LCK, and I think they're going to perform like it. So let's go ahead and talk about what you are seeing up on your screen right now. Of course, the team name at the top, in this case DRX, you can see the number next to the team name, in this case number 10. That's going to be where I power rank them from number 1 to number 10 in parentheses, and this is the case for any graphic throughout the entire rest of this video. That parentheses marker is going to denote what the change was from this version of this video in summer of last year. So not the end of summer, but the beginning of summer. I think that's a more apt comparison, considering we haven't really had tape on a lot of these players. You know, Kespa Cup happened, but as you guys know, Kespa Cup's not always the best indicator of how people are going to perform over the course of a year. And, you know, I just think that that's an interesting comparison. How do I feel about where this organization and this team was moving in comparison to where they were? So DRX is number 10. They have a -1 because they were number 9 going into my summer split power rankings last year, and they're going down 1 spot from there. You can see how they finished in 2025 because spring and summer had combined records. It really only felt fair to say 2025 and not so much the summer split record up there. DRX finished 9th with a 9-21 record, a 29-47 overall game score, and then they are in Group Elder. There are 2 groups like I talked about, Group Baron and Group Elder. They will all play against every team from the other group. DRX is in Group Elder. You can see all 5 of the starting members of the team at the bottom. A couple of things to point out. If you see a little, you know, icon, we'll just say, after the name of any player, that just denotes that there is another player on the roster that is at the very least worth talking about, that has been mentioned as a potential 6th man or somebody that could come in and start at some point. We'll talk about those specifics when we get to those players. In this case, you can see that next to Vincenzo because DRX technically has 2 junglers here. Then you can see where I rank every single player in their role. The number, you know, 8 for Rich or 9 for Vincenzo is where I personally rank them within their role. And then again, in parentheses, that's going to be how this organization has changed from the summer split primer to now. not so much the individual player. Someone like Jiwoo, who was starting in the LCK last year, is being compared to Teddy, the starting AD carry from DRX, not Jiwoo on Nongshim from last year and where he was ranked, because I think it's fair to talk about the direction the org is heading rather than, the direction the player is heading, because I think we can touch upon those individually. New should be pretty self-explanatory, and that is everything you are seeing on the screen. That is so much preamble, but I have to do it for videos like this for new viewers, so let's finally get into the analysis. DRX's lineup in 2026 is looking like Rich in the top lane, Vincenzo in the jungle, Yukal in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Ondal at support. Of course, a couple of players coming back here. Some, I feel good about. Some I actually really like the punt on bringing them back. I think the solo laners coming back here is a generally good idea, or Yukal, I guess, getting reinserted into the starting lineup here I think is a good idea. I even think that taking a punt on someone like Vincenzo is a good idea, even if I am a bit lower on the tape that we saw out of the Challengers League. But I think there are real problems with this team, and I really, really fail to see the floor of where this team ends up landing. There is not really an argument from me that this is the lowest floor team in the LCK, and that's why they come in as number 10. Let's talk about the solo laners first. I think that not only is going to be this team's strength, but also the part that I feel the most, solid about. We'll start with Rich in the top lane. Rich has had a funny career. I think generally speaking, we just know what he is at this point. Even if he did have a couple of moments last year where he kind of exceeded the idea of what Rich is as a player, he is very much a one-trick pony in terms of the type that he plays. Not so much in the champions, but the type of game that he likes to play. He is a terrible, terrible laner. He is somebody who is basically never even going to go remotely even in the 1v1, especially in good matchups. He just kind of throws away counterpick, which is why teams don't often save it for him. But he's incredibly good at team fighting. He is very adept at being able to play even with low resources in the later part of the game. And if you can give him a neutral laning phase, if you can get him through that early game, which he did better at last year than he has in the last couple of years, especially, at a top tier level, not so much in the LCS because it's a little bit easier to do that there, but especially in the LCK or the LPL, if you can get this guy to survive laning phase, he's going to be very important and adept in the later part of the game. The problem is that good teams can just kind of stop that from happening, and that's kind of what we've seen very consistently for Rich throughout his entire career, is that, against bad teams where he can just survive in lane and where they don't really have a lot of aggression in the early game, it's pretty easy to see why he's a valuable LCK top laner. But when he goes up against teams that either camp him on the top side, send a lot of resources to make sure he's super far behind, or alternatively, when he just gets dumpstered in the 1v1, which I think is very likely throughout a lot of this year, it's just really tough for him to be able to survive those game states because he does not have the mechanics to really be able to push that forward. But that still comes out as around the 8th best top laner. He is a valuable piece to have, if not a limiting one in terms of the way that you maybe want to play the game. I'm certainly not going to sit here and pound the table for Rich and talk about him as somebody that I think is going to break out this year, but he was better last year than I ever thought he was going to be coming back to the LCK because of those playstyle limitations. There were even moments last year where he was going neutral on his own in lane, which is never really something he's been capable of doing consistently, even in the LCS. So really excited to see that. Hopefully he's a stable enough top laner. I'm not going to sit here and say that with Morgan leaving, he's kind of taking that role, but that long-standing, stable enough top laner who's not crazy exciting, but will win you a couple of games. That's, I think, the role that Rich is going to fill for DRX. And then there's Yukal in the mid lane, and he is the other player I really want to talk about here, because I think if this team does have some upside to be better than number 9 or number 10 in the LCK, it's almost entirely going to be this mid-jungle duo, and Yukal is probably the more important part of that equation. Yukal is such an interesting player to try and talk about because I've been hyping this guy up basically since this channel started. Obviously, he had some time in the LCK, breaking through as a big young prospect on KT Rolster many years ago, but it was really his time in the LPL that alerted me to how good he individually was, because I think he was on some really good teams and he kind of got some of his flaws hidden. He goes to a terrible Thunder Talk team after being pretty bad in his final years in the LCK, and he hard carries Thunder Talk for multiple years in a row. He gets that team to playoffs. He ends up being one of the more valuable mid laners in the entirety of the LPL, so much so that he gets another job back here in the LCK, and he more than earned that. In the LCK Cup, in the winter split last year, he was exceptionally good. DRX actually looked like a pretty dangerous team, and Yukal looked like one of the best mid laners in the entire region. It was really staggering how good he looked in winter, and then something happened in between, first stand and the start of the LCK spring split, because by the start of the LCK spring split, this guy could not play League of Legends. It was staggering just how much worse he was performing in spring, and then he eventually gets benched on this team for Yehu, who's now obviously over in the LEC, but he more than earned getting benched. He was absolutely horrendous for this DRX team, arguably the worst performing mid laner laner in the entire region, and that includes people like Vikla, who I think people really clown on. UCal was like right at the bottom in terms of how he was playing in spring and even how he was playing at times in summer when he got some chances. Like, he just did not look like a human mid laner, and I have no clue what happened there, because that is a true outlier type of performance, especially because he had already looked good coming back from the LPL in the winter split. So you're just hopeful that that is an outlier. I think DRX sticking with him and going into 2026 with him as their starting mid laner is kind of a vote of confidence, if you will, that he's going to be able to get some of his mojo back. He was really good in the Challengers League when he was playing for DRX Challengers after he was benched. So I just have to imagine that it was something mental, that it was just maybe the meta or just the place he was at in real life. Like, something was going wrong for UCal. I really like DRX saying, well, we're going to hope that last year was an outlier, because I don't think that there are a lot of mid laners that you could get as a team like DRX that would give you more upside than UCal just getting back into form. So he's going to come in as my number 8 mid laner, despite him being much worse than that throughout last year. So the solo laners are fine. They're not exceptional. You know, Rich is very limited and UCal has a very low floor because of the inconsistency, but I like them being on this team. I think you can win with those two as your solo laners. The problem is everybody else. I talked about mid jungle being the most important part of this team, and I will really stand by that. I'm just lower on Vincenzo, and that might be a take that really comes back to bite me. There have been players that I've been low on coming out of the Challengers League that have looked fantastic, and I've been very happy to say, oh, I was wrong, and to change my tune and to hype them up a little bit more. Right now, you know, the LCK Challengers League MVP to me feels a little bit overrated. I did not think he was the MVP of the Challengers League. I think he was on a really good team, and I think he had some, you know, big pieces of talent around him that ended up really stepping up and playing some of the best league everybody on that team had played throughout their career. But his role really wasn't all that difficult. He didn't have to do all that much for T1 on their Challengers team. He really kind of just got to, you know, win with a lot of winning lanes. Like, his job just was so much easier than I think so many other players. Zinni, to me, for what it's worth, would have been my LCK Challengers League MVP. I thought he was the best player in the Challengers League last year, but we'll see how it ends up playing out. I think Vincenzo is more of a carry-oriented player. He can play facilitators, and I think he is pretty solid in that regard. And basically, no matter what, this is an upgrade in terms of potential from what this team has had recently, because Sponge has just not been a good LCK jungler. More on that later when we talk about the team that he went to. You know, there is a number 10 on this list, I'll promise you that. But, you know, Vincenzo is just somebody that I need to see perform well. I've talked about this a lot in these videos throughout the years, but the jump between the LCK Challengers League and the LCK, Tier 2 to Tier 1 in Korea, is the biggest gap of any Tier 1 or to Tier 2 league anywhere in the world. It's not close. There's no other Tier 2 to Tier 1 jump that is more difficult to make than the LCK, and Vincenzo's going to need to be a pretty big piece of this team day number 1, and I just don't even really know if he has the talent around him that's going to ease his transition. He's basically going from one of the best situations possible on T1's Challengers team to probably the worst situation he could be in the LCK right now, with DRX expected to be a major piece day number 1. Worth noting, I do have that little icon next to Vincenzo. They do have Willer here, at least on their Challengers League team. Longtime LCK fans, I guess, will remember Willer. Not that he's that hard to remember. He's been around the league for a very long time. This guy's been killing the Challengers League for multiple years in a row and has just not really been given a chance in the LCK. I've always been a massive fan of Willer. I think he is a very feast or famine player, somebody who's either going to win you or lose you the game, but I do think he has pretty great upside, and honestly, I'd rather see this team play Willer with the way that they're constructed. Like most teams in the league, I'd rather them have Vincenzo because I think he gives you more upside in terms of what he could turn into, but I think this team needs their jungler to be like the best player on the team right now, and I just don't know if Vincenzo is ready for that day number 1. I think Willer might be a little bit more prepared. They certainly are hedging their bets with this jungle position, bringing him in, but you know, Willer's kind of been the backup to basically everybody that he's played with over the past couple of years, Raptor most notably over on BNK FearX, so I doubt he gets the starting job day number 1, but just worth noting that he is at the very least here, and he would probably bring a slightly higher floor to what this team could accomplish. And then we get to the bot lane, the final part to talk about here. Ondel being returned from last year and Jiwoo coming over from Nongshim. I don't like this bot lane. I don't think it's going to surprise a lot of people that I'm not very high on this bot lane. Ironically enough, Jiwoo is probably the player I feel better about as opposed to Ondel. Ondel, I think, just gives you such a low ceiling in terms of who he is as a player. Very inconsistent, often plays his worst League of Legends down the stretch of a split when it matters the most, and so just don't feel good about him. We'll talk about him a bit more in a second, but Jiwoo is coming in as my number 1080 carry, and that's because he was terrible last year for Nongshim, a team that really needed him to be at the very least competence, like bare minimum kinds of competence, and he just could not provide that. but Jiwoo looked like a really good prospect just a year before. This looked like somebody that was, in a prime position to potentially break out as a top 5 or top, 6-ish AD carry, something like what Dokdum was last year for KT Rolster, and he just completely fell off a cliff in 2025. He was in the spot to, really kind of use his great teammates like Lehens and like Kingen and even Gideon, who had a great year, to kind of propel himself up the AD carry ladder, and he just completely shit the bed, was the worst AD carry in the LCK, and DRX is taking a leap and saying, I hope that that's an outlier again, very similar to UCal. We're just kind of throwing out 2025 and saying that, we have to hope that the talent that these players had shown before last year is more real, and I'm okay with that, as a bad team kind of taking that leap. I think Jiwoo, again, there are very few players that are going to give you more upside than what Jiwoo could give you if he does end up hitting, but the floor is still mega low, because if you're getting the 2025 versions of UCal and Jiwoo, and even Ondol and Rich, like, this is the worst team in the league by far, if that's going to be the case. And, I already said it with Ondol, but he's just such an uninteresting player. Like, I hate to really boil it down to something so, baseline, but he just doesn't really do anything at a high-end level. He honestly reminds me a lot of someone like Polu, who just recently signed with KT Rolster, where there are times where it feels like he can make an impact and be a playmaker on the map. It's just not consistent at all, and on a game-to-game basis, his floor is also astronomically low. I've been pretty low on this guy for quite a while on this channel. I just don't really see it on tape, and I think if the floor of Jiwoo and Ondol is like an LCK Challengers League bottom tier bot lane, that is a problem for an LCK team that is trying to compete. And I think especially because you're kind of relying on Jiwoo getting back into form, and you're relying on UCal getting back into form, and you're relying on Vincenzo being good day number 1. There are so many things that have to go right for this DRX team for them to even be competitive, like top 8 kind of competitive, that it's really hard to predict that they're going to be in that kind of zone. Right now, to me, DRX is the worst team in the LCK, and I would expect them to really struggle in the winter split. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and a team with a slight name change, not the last one that we will talk about in today's video, and a real big youth movement for them. It's HANJIN BRION here, coming in as my number 9 team in my power rankings. They, of course, finished 8th last year. Were decently competitive in some games, but overall were clearly a part of the bottom 3, along with DRX and a DN FearX team that has renamed, and we will talk about them a bit later, but they completely overhauled their roster. All 5 members of this team are brand new going into 2026, and while I like some of these changes, I'm not as much of a fan of others, as you can see with some of these rankings. There's a couple in particular that really scare me. I just think there's a little bit more upside here than maybe what you're getting out of DRX. I think that there are a couple of players here that I do really like and that I think have relatively high floors. And again, like I said, the ceiling here is actually pretty good if everyone ends up hitting. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Casting in the top lane, Gideon in the jungle, Fisher in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Namgung at support. There's good and bad, as it will be towards the bottom of the standings. I guess nobody's really surprised to hear that, especially out of BRION, who's obviously not the most trusted organization, we'll just say, in the LCK in terms of finding ways to make their team better in the offseason. But they kind of took a punt on youth last year, bringing in a couple of KT Challengers players like Hanbok and like Hype. It didn't work for them. Hype was okay, and I generally would have preferred to see him back as opposed to Teddy, but, Hanbok was terrible. We'll see how he does over in North America. You move on from Polu, or at the very least, Polu ends up going somewhere else, which was an experiment you had for a couple of years here on BRION. Like, a lot of the projects that they brought in last year did not work, and they're moving into different projects, which I guess is just kind of what you need to do in terms of rebuilding if things don't work. But you just have to hope that it's, the players and not the system that were broken, because you really don't want to see a lot of these players who have a lot of upside come to this org and then completely flame out. The one player I feel the best about is Gideon in the jungle, and I know this feels like a weird player to feel good about because he really ended the year on a sour note. Everybody in that legend group just absolutely dumpstered on Nongshim. Like, there's no way for that team to have looked even remotely competent because they just had to play the 4 teams that were going to Worlds over and over and over again. They lost all their confidence, and Gideon just ended up not really being able to show off in the summer split last year. But when he actually got to play a lot of the other teams in the LCK, he was looking like one of the best junglers in the LCK at the beginning of the year in winter and in spring, which is really exciting, I think, for this BRION team that had Gideon in the first place. Let's not forget that I believe it was 2024 spring split where Gideon was on this team and was the starting jungler, and they bring him back over from Invictus and from the LPL, and he performs much better than anyone ever predicted that he would on this team. They replace him for no reason in the summer split by bringing Young-Jae on, who I do like. I like Young-Jae. Trust me, I'm not trying to flame him. I think he's also a good jungler, but Gideon just really found his footing. He ends up going over to Nongshim at the beginning of the year, and he looks really solid. He's, like I said, awesome for most of last year until he just gets pummeled by the legend group over and over again. To to me, this is a great pickup. I think he is truly one of the best free agents available, you know, especially outside of the big names. If you're looking for, you know, a bottom tier team to try to get a player that I think has not only good upside, but a good floor, I think Gideon was one of the best options on the market at any position. And I think BRION's going to be really happy that they were able to get him. He comes in as my number 6 jungler. I think he's close to being a top half jungler right now, and I think it's very possible that he's, you know, maybe even higher than this. There are players above him that he was maybe better than for parts of last year, which we will talk about a little bit later. I'm just kind of banking on the fact that I think they will be better. But the other player that I'm really excited about here is casting on the top side. You know, that KT Challengers team, I think, has kind of shown some good and some bad traits at different levels. We've seen multiple players come up from that team and just not be able to make the transition to tier 1, most notably players like Hanwha, obviously, that weren't very good in the LCK last year, or Wei, who was a disaster for KT, so much so that to get to Worlds, they had to completely bench him and move in a different direction. But I am cautiously containing my optimism for casting. I do believe that he is going to be better than the results that you got out of a lot of the other KT Challengers players last year, mostly because I think he kind of showed that isolated from how well the rest of the team was playing, his mechanics are just insane. He's so good in lane. He really is able to dominate and take over and generate resources for himself, really without a lot of assistance. We didn't get a ton of chances to see that when he got to play over Perfect in the LCK last year, mostly because I think Perfect is a better player than Casting is, but Casting's pretty darn close. I certainly don't think he's all that far off from where Perfect was by the end of last year. So you're hoping that with some development, like this duo of Casting and Gideon can really be kind of a centralizing force here for BRION that I think really could kind of carry them above where their ranking is. That's why they come in at number 9 and not at number 10 for me, because it's harder to imagine DRX having a kind of duo that breaks out in the same way that I can imagine Casting and Gideon having a very good part of their split. The other players on this team I think are interesting, but like interesting in a bad way, and we'll talk about that. Teddy and Namgung as a bot lane, we'll get to Fisher last. Teddy and Namgung as a bot lane is intriguing, but like only at the surface level. I don't know how else to say that. Like this is a bot lane, I think, with a ton of question marks. Teddy comes in as my number 8 AD carry. Nobody who's followed the channel will be surprised to see that he ranks pretty low for me. I've just never been a Teddy fan. I think his playstyle is not really conducive to actually winning games. I think it really only looks good in box scores. He does a lot of damage and he doesn't really do anything else. Like he sits there and he just kind of hopes and prays that his team sets him up. He really has no agency on the map. He's not a particularly great laner. He's pretty solid at farming and at CSing. He's going to look pretty good from a gold perspective, but in terms of pressuring out lane and generating advantages for his team to be able to capitalize, or God forbid playing strong side, he just doesn't really do that. Like he can't really actually be the guy that you play through, and I think as an AD carry, that's a really difficult sell. I think he is mechanically talented, but it's the lack of a killer instinct that's always been a big problem for him. I think we saw more of that at the end of last year for DRX when the guy just stopped caring, but honestly, after a decade, I'm just not going to believe that that's the real version of Teddy. Teddy is a very passive player who's not really going to win you games. He's just going to be a part of the process if other people on your team are winning you games. And you know, while I think there are pieces on this team that are good, it's good that Teddy doesn't have to be the number 1 guy like he had to be for DRX and even Sandbox at other times in his career. You know, obviously going back to the Gen Air days, like this guy's had to be a number 1 in multiple spots, and I just don't think that that's a very good spot for him. I think being a secondary or tertiary carry on this team could be effective if you have a good mid laner, and I think that that is a really big if. And also, I think you kind of need a really good support, and that's my big concern with Namgung. I don't want this to seem like I'm kind of, you know, ragging on Namgung. I think he could be a really interesting player. It's just impossible to try and evaluate him. I talked about this in my offseason grades video. Go watch the LCK Challengers League tape for Gen.G and try to evaluate that team. This organization has always been a nightmare to try and grade players on coming from the Challengers League, because they always play a very specific style, which is to find the one player that they like the most on their roster and just give him every resource, like actually funnel them. That was Quid when he was playing for them, and that's what made him so difficult to evaluate when he went over to North America. And last year, that was about the AD carry for Gen.G that obviously went over to WE. That makes Namgung very difficult to evaluate because he didn't really have to do anything other than play strictly for his AD carry and play the 2v2, which is not something he's going to do on this team. I don't really know how to tell you that. Teddy does not play that style. He is not going to be hyper carryable. It's just not really the way that he has ever functioned in his career. So Namgung is going to have to play with Gideon. He's going to have to play on an open map a little bit more, and there's just no tape on that. There's like 0 tape on him actively doing that against good competition. So he might be good at it. He might be bad at it. He was good in the small sample size, but his floor on what role they're probably going to ask him to play is astronomically low because we have no tape on it. So, you know, maybe he's good, maybe he's bad. For now, he comes in as my number 10 support, and I'm worried about this bot lane. I do not think they have particularly good synergy in the kinds of play styles that we've seen both of these players have, but anything could happen. I think both of them are fine enough mechanically, so if you are able to kind of mend those playstyle barriers, I think there could be something in the bot lane, but it's the mid lane that really concerns me. This team brings over Fissure, the mid laner who got benched on Nongshim last year because Calyx was just better, and now he's the starting mid laner again here for Bro, and I just don't understand. Is it him and Gideon? Are they just really good friends? Does Gideon want to play with Fissure? Was that his signing condition, that they sign Fissure and start him as the mid laner? Because I just don't really understand. Fissure has at no point in his career shown consistent tier 1 level tape, either in the LPL or in the LCK. It's just never happened. This guy was one of the most hyped prospects in the world for years, over and over and over again. I would have to hear about how this guy is going to be a superstar at the tier 1 level while being average at the tier 2 level, and then he finally gets a shot in tier 1, and he's just not ever looked good since then. He's been better, I would say, in the LCK than he was in the LPL, and there were moments at the end of like the spring split last year where it felt like things were starting to come together. At the very least, he was starting to feel more comfortable playing in lane, but this guy has no real mechanical ceiling. The floor is astronomically low on what a game-to-game from Fissure looks like. I just don't really like this move. I think he's the weakest mid laner day number 1 in the LCK, and it's hard to imagine that he gets better on this team. Again, him and Gideon seem to have the best chemistry of anybody Fissure has ever played with, but I would just much rather see an actually good mid laner here than Fissure. I think you're downgrading pretty heavily going from someone like Closer, who I think, you know, I'm a bit lower on generally speaking, but is a fine enough LCK mid laner, to someone in Fissure who I just think is kind of a pretty big negative, and that's why you get that -4 there. I think this position is in a pretty bad spot, and it does rank dead last for me in the entire league. But I will also say this team did once again re-sign a 6th player. At the very least, they kind of announced that there was another player coming in, and that is Roamer. And those of you who, you know, might remember the name Roamer, you probably remember him from the NACL when he was in Team Liquid's organization as their starting mid laner. He was playing in the LTA South last year. And he's an interesting player, man. He looked really good in the Challengers League before he went over to the Americas, and he still looked pretty good in Tier 2 in North America, just never really was that dominant, like, complete game-warping, game-breaking type of player that I think we wanted him to be. I think he's better than Fissure. I certainly think he has more upside than Fissure, or at least gives you a more interesting option. He's a better punt than Fissure is, and so I wouldn't be surprised to see if he ends up starting in the mid lane spot here over Fissure, but it's clear that Gideon and Fissure kind of came over as a package duo, so I would expect these two to kind of start day number 1. If they don't, if this is Roamer, I think this team has much more upside, but the floor is still pretty damn low because Roamer wasn't exactly dominating the LTA South last year. So some good and some bad with Bro in terms of their 2026. Not that you can really expect anything else from this org. I think getting Gideon is a huge deal. I think getting Casting is a really big deal. Even Teddy is a really good stabilizer down on the bot side if you want to try and enable a lot of these other younger players. He just can't be your number 1 option, but players like Namgung having very little tape in what I expect them to do over the course of this split, and someone like Fissure having a lot of tape and none of it being particularly good, just give me a lot of pause on this team actually being competitive. So for me, they're in a pretty clear bottom 2 alongside DRX. But now moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and I do believe this is like a half step up in terms of a tier jump. I think bottom 2 for me felt very obvious going into this video. I always kind of knew who the bottom 2 were going to be, but everybody else I think is at least interesting on paper in some way, shape, or form. I just think this team is clearly the least interesting of the ones left. Coming in at number 8 for me, it is the newly renamed DN SOOPers, and you know, I have to address the rumors. Everybody has been asking me, is there any sort of bias and any sort of thing that we have to worry about with Super K-Man Rocks and, of course, the DN SOOPers? I assure you, I will be just as harsh on them as I was last year, and I will be just as harsh on this organization as I have been, although clearly I am now unofficially affiliated with them because of their name. Jokes aside, this offseason at the very least gives you something to be interested about when it comes to a team that was an absolute disaster in 2025. Everything that could go wrong went wrong for this team last year, and now they're at the very least in a position where they have a couple of players coming off of a World Finals appearance and a mid laner who I think just came off of maybe the best year of his career. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup in 2026 is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Pyosik in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Dr. AD carry, and Peter at support. Of course, you know, this is a weird team to talk about because every single one of these players is coming from drastically different places last year. You have two players that were on this team that were disasters, quite frankly, in 2025, players that I think have completely run down any positive goodwill that they've had over the course of their careers in recent memory. They're just not in good spots. And then you have, you know, a mid laner that I've always been a little bit lower on, I would say, than consensus. I've always pushed back on the hype train for Closer because of the fact that he kind of gets this T1 rub that basically everybody who comes out of that system gets. You know, Poby got it, Fisher got it. You know, there are going to be more players in the future that end up getting it. If you were a mid laner to come out of the T1 system, you're kind of expected to be a pretty big deal. Closer obviously sharing time with Faker for a little bit. He's been fine in his LCK career, but he's not a superstar. And then two bot laners that are coming off of, I don't know, Game 5 of the World Finals. Like, that was the last time they played, you know, Tier 1 League of Legends. Kind of insane to see that they are now on the DN SOOPers, but we'll talk about why that was kind of the expectation all off-season long. We'll start with the top side because they are the players that are getting retained here. Dudu and Pyosik are the two players to return from the nightmarishly bad DN FearX season last year, and I'm not going to say they're the two I would have brought back if I could. Obviously, Berserker would have been my number one, but he goes back to North America. That clearly felt like something that was always going to happen, whether it was with Lion, who he ended up landing on, or some other team, Cloud9. You know, he was always going back to NA to try and recapture that glory. And then, you know, outside of that, probably no one else was on my list to return. Dudu, I think, makes sense. I think he's somebody that at the very least has shown the ability to look good in the right circumstance. Even in bad circumstances, this guy has looked good for most of his career. This was somebody who I was talking about as a top 3-ish top laner in the LCK back in 2023 and 2024. He's just never really been able to maintain that. He's never been able to kind of elevate from that position. He was on some terrible teams at the beginning of his career, whether it be Hanwha Life or, you know, the Guangdong Freaks when they were really bad. And it really felt like he was the only one performing well in a lot of instances, but it's just never translated. I think he's gotten worse basically every year of his career after looking like a fantastic prospect. And now he's very much a prove-it player. He's got to prove that he belongs in the LCK, even though he did have such a great start to his career. And he was somebody that was a channel darling, somebody who I was really going to bat for. Like, it's just no longer the case when it comes to him as a player. He's going to rank as my number 9 top laner. You know, with what we saw last year, it wasn't just, oh, the system is bad and the rest of the team is bad, therefore he's playing bad. He was actively losing in lane very consistently. He was a pretty major problem in team fights as well. He just looked really washed last year. There's not really a ton to say, but again, you can maybe chalk at least part of that up to the fact that the entire team and the mental surrounding everything on DNF last year was just completely destroyed and there was no way to recover it. So, you know, hopefully you get a better version of Dudu. I think he probably would have been the second player that I brought back from DNF last year behind Berserker, but Pyosik coming back here is just a major question mark to me. He's still coming in as my number 8 jungler because I think that there are some question marks on the bottom 2 guys. Like we've already talked about, Vincenzo I'm already a bit lower on, as we've talked about, and we'll get to Sponge a little bit later. No spoilers, obviously, but you probably could have guessed who number 10 on this list was for me. But Pyosik is certainly not a good starter in the LCK. This guy has not only been mega washed, but mega tilted for like 3 years in a row. You know, it was one of the better takes, I think, in this channel's history is when he went over to North America after winning Worlds in 2023. I had him ranked, I think, as like the 3rd jungler at the beginning of the year, below a couple of endemic players in North America, Blabber, and then, you know, somebody else. I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Inspired. I can't actually remember, but people were really mad at me. Like, this guy just won Worlds and you're not even calling him the number 1 jungler. And I think that people just have always misrepresented who Pyosik is as a player. He's super feast or famine. He's incredibly flippy. And honestly, he's a byproduct of how good the rest of his team is. He is not a creator. He's not really somebody that elevates talent around him. He's just a really aggressive player that is going to lose you a ton of games over the course of a year. We saw that when he came back to the LCK in 2024 on KT Rolster, and then what was supposed to be kind of a role player all-star team, you know, those never work, last year on the DN FearX. Like, he was a nightmare. He was arguably the worst jungler in the entire league from a raw performance perspective, and he was probably the worst player on the team over the course of the year. Life was terrible. Bulldog was also terrible, which I've talked about already on this channel, but Pyosik was right up there with them for being the worst players on this team, being somebody that I just never wanted to see in the LCK again, and this is the last shot. I mean, it truly was bottom of the barrel last year. I've basically already given up on hoping that Pyosik is going to have a career turnaround. If he's not even average this year, what are we doing? We're completely wasting time. I lambasted this organization for not benching him in the middle of last year because you had someone like Void in the Challengers League. and then you bring him back. So this is make or break. Like, this is truly like do or die for Pyosik, in my opinion. If he is not, again, if he's not good this year, like, you've completely wasted everybody's time by bringing him back. And then, you know, like I've talked about with the rest of the team, there's good and bad. Closer had probably the best year of his entire career last year, and I know that feels like a really weird thing to say because he's been an all-pro in the LCK before. He's had some success back in 2022 when Sandbox was good with Prince and with KT and with Krako. Like, that team he was an all-pro on, but as I said at the time, he was an all-pro because his team was good, not because he was good. He was actually a pretty big negative towards that team, and one of the bigger reasons why they ended up not making Worlds that year, and then he never really was able to find that form again. He was pretty consistently an inconsistent mid laner, if that makes any sense, where he could really only play the assassins in the mid lane. He's kind of that Zeka mold type of player, and then he kind of broke out of that a little bit last year. I think his control mages and his general shove and roam style looked a lot better in 2025 than it did at any other point throughout his career, and he really was a carry for Bro for a majority of that year. He was the only reason that they were semi-relevant and really the main player that was pushing that team forward. So I am excited to see him come over here to DN SOOPers because I think he's a good mid laner right now in the LCK, which is not something they had last year, but he's not a game breaker. He's not somebody that's going to elevate the rest of this team. He's like the example of a B minus kind of player. He's fine to have, but you don't want him to be the #1 option, which he might have to be on this team for a majority of the year, but you're hoping that this World Finals bot lane can come in and, you know, keep the same form that they had over the course of that World Championships. KT Rolster wants to move into a different direction. I don't even really blame them for that. It's not like these two were sensational throughout a lot of last year. Doctum was terrible up until Peter came in as the starting support, and then he really got salvaged. But Peter being on this team, I think, is the biggest possible win that they can have. We've talked about a bunch of players that I'm not really all that high on. If this team is going to outperform my expectations and get somewhere better than 8th or even 7th in the league, if they're top 6, it's because Peter really is as good as I think he is. He's coming in as the #6 support for me, but I think it's perfectly fair to put him at #4 or anywhere as high as that. This guy is tremendously good at the game, and I think he doesn't get nearly enough credit for how important he was towards basically saving KT Rolster's season last year. Yes, Cuz was really good. Yes, BDD is obviously one of the best players in the world, but if you don't have Peter on that team, they don't even make the World Championships. I'm pretty confident in saying that that's how much of an upgrade Peter was when he came in mid-season. He is a playmaker. He loves things like Nico and Rakan, and he fit the meta last year perfectly. If he can continue to be a primary creation, you know, player for a team like DN SOOPers, all of a sudden, you know, Closer and Doctum and Pyosik, they have way more options than they did last year in terms of the way that they can play the game. So Peter really is the piece on this team that I feel genuinely can be an elite level talent. It's just really hard for me to imagine that's actually going to work because he's a support on a bad team with not really a ton of hard carries around him. Doctum is really good for what he is. I will say the same thing I've said about him, you know, throughout his entire career. He is a jack of all trades, master of none type of AD carry. He's really solid in every phase of the game. You know, I would say slightly above average at everything. He's a good laner. He's a good team fighter, but I wouldn't say he's very good at anything. You know, you can get him champions like Caitlyn, and he can generate pretty big leads if you want to invest resources into him, but he's going to let you down in the mid game at times. He's not really all that aggressive. Like, you know, he is more of a byproduct of the rest of the team. I think he's more stable than a lot of the other players that I kind of give that label to. We talked about someone like Teddy in the previous segment. I think Doctum is better than Teddy. He ranks one spot above him because I do think he has more agency on the map. At the very least, when he does get resources, he does something with them. He just isn't really all that great at generating those resources by himself, and he's not the most mechanically talented player in the world. In fact, the mechanics are probably his weak point as an AD carry. He's a decently smart player, very stable, but does need, you know, good playmaking. Luckily, him and Peter obviously had great chemistry last year. Doctum played great at Worlds and really started to come into his own in the summer split, so you're hopeful you can get that chemistry back over. Peter is excellent, and Doctum obviously can capitalize on it. If you can get another year, kind of like 2025, out of Closer, and then hopefully anything out of the top side that you are bringing back here, you do have a team that's interesting. You have a team that is closer to competing for top 6 than they are for bottom 1, but there's just some, like, mojo, like voodoo around this team. There's not really much else to say. I've talked about it a lot in other player reviews, where it's like every single player that comes through this system, whether they are the Afrika Freaks, the Kwangdong Freaks, the DN Freaks, or now the DN SOOPers, it doesn't really matter. Every player who has come through this system has been worse off for it. They have gotten worse while in this org, while playing for this team. And if that's going to be the case, if someone like Peter comes in and becomes a weaker playmaker, or, you know, becomes not a very good support at this level, and if you have someone like Closer who reverts to what he was in like 2023 and 2024, where I think he was just a below average mid laner, Pyosik plays the way he did last year, Doctum plays the way he did at the beginning of last year, like all of those things are possible, and this team actually could very well be bottom 1. If that ends up being the case. I'm kind of betting on at least some of the talent here, most notably Peter in the support position to, really step up and be solid enough, but there definitely is a world where the Soopers once again are near the bottom of the standings. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this was actually an international champion from last year, although it's a tournament a lot of people probably forgot to tune into. It's BNK FearX coming in at number 7 for me. Your defending Asia Invitational champions at the end of the year. Of course, a pretty fun tournament that we covered on LPL English, but there are a lot of things that need to be fixed here for FearX. I think this is a team that potentially others might have higher because of the consistency and the general vibe kind of surrounding this organization right now. They end up beating Dplus KIA, a team we have yet to talk about, in those finals of the Asia International Tournament. They're returning all 5 members from last year, and you've got a young superstar down on the bottom side, but I think there's actually some room for regression for a team that I think kind of overperformed throughout a majority of last year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Clear in the top lane, Raptor in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Diablo at AD carry, and Kellen at support. Really no place to start other than the bot lane for this team because they haven't changed anything. That means that their playstyle is likely to be almost identical to what it was in 2025, and that means that this is a bot lane centric team. I think that even kind of undercuts just how many resources this team puts onto the bottom side of the map. They really only have one way that they can play the game, but their AD carry is so good that it almost doesn't matter. Diablo for me is coming in as a top 4 AD carry in the LCK right now. You know who the top 3 are. They're the 3 players on the 3 best teams, which you can probably already guess. He is the best outside of those top 3, in my opinion. I really would take him over anyone else in the LCK right now. He has proven everything he's needed to as a rookie here for FearX. I came into last year kind of being like, I don't really get it. I watched his Challengers League tape, and he was an aggressive ADC, but he didn't really have the overall mental to be able to back it up. Well, all he really needed was to get paired with Kellen, who can basically just take this glass cannon ADC that's super aggressive, that's constantly going to push too far forward and like aim the cannon. You know what I mean? All Kellen had to do was be the person to operate Diablo's hands, and he could carry them to victories, and that's exactly what happened last year. Diablo might have the best mechanics of any AD carry in the world. He really is that talented and that good at playing the role. The problem is, like I said, he's all hands, no brakes, all gas, no brakes, if that's how you want to put it. He really is super aggressive, and he's going to get himself into bad positions, especially against good teams, which is what we saw last year when this team tried to take on, more complete rosters, is that teams would put a lot of resources into making sure anyone but Diablo had to beat them, and this team couldn't really do that. Diablo himself will get himself into bad situations even with good resources because he is so aggressive and so greedy to get more gold, but him and Kellen have great synergy together as a duo. They were both excellent last year, and I think, if you want a franchise player for an organization like FearX, Diablo is just about as good as it's ever going to get. I compared him to Leave last year, the AD carry over in the LPL, but the best way I can put it, it's like if Leave was actually good. That's what Diablo is as a player, all due respect to Leave fans out there. But Diablo really is like a superstar in waiting. He showed everything that he needed to show in year number 1 to showcase that he is somebody to watch out for potentially taking a big leap in year 2 if he doesn't have a sophomore slump. And then the reason I feel good about that is because Kellen is also back here. I have been a massive Kellen defender over the course of this channel's history. I think this guy gets ragged on by the community over and over and over again, and I think it's almost never deserved. All this guy has done is go from org to org, making them one of the better macro teams in the entire league and really stabilizing their bot lane with any different AD carry that you could ask him to. It's been like repetitive. Like I can even go back, I think the farthest back I can go to say that Kellen was really a difference maker was that Nongshim team in 2021. He was obviously very good before that, but I think it was that team in particular with Dukdum and with Gory and, with Peanut that I think really showcased what Kellen can do from a macro perspective. He goes to Dplus KIA alongside Dukdum. That team is always complaining about, our macro needs to be better, and then they always bench Kellen, whether it be for Bible or whether it eventually be for Moham, which was a ridiculous mistake, and every single time they benched him, their macro immediately got worse, and in Moham's case, they became the single worst macro team in the entire world when that guy was playing support. And then he goes over to these other teams, and all of a sudden their macro gets a ton better. This guy's shot calling is clearly just exceptionally good, and he is very, very good at being able to pace early laning phases, and I think that's what's really good for Diablo when you talk about generating resources on the bottom side of the map. Arguably no support in the world is easier to play with than Kellen in terms of generating resources, so It's always been a really good duo. Kellen himself is still a decent playmaker. His mechanics have always been his weak point. He will make plays on the map, and I think he was very effective last year in the role that he was asked to play, but really his main role here is making sure Diablo can take over and carry the game. He doesn't need to be Peter, who we just talked about, who is kind of a dynamic playmaker. He can be more of the voice and allow Diablo to be the hands. But the rest of the team, they're all kind of accompanying pieces to what is a bot lane for this team. And I know that feels like a very weird thing to say about a 5-man League of Legends roster, but genuinely that's how FearX plays. Like, it's Diablo, kind of Kellen, and then 3 wards in terms of being able to set them up. Raptor maybe deserves a little bit more than that. I thought Raptor was pretty good last year. I've always been a pretty big fan of him, at least in comparison to what consensus is. I think he's clearly a pretty solid LCK jungler. I would compare him to a former Sandbox jungler in Krakow. I think they're very similar players in the way that they operate, and I think they have very similar roles at their absolute best, which is to say Raptor looked really good last year when he could facilitate Diablo. He can still carry games. He actually came up through their system as a very, carry-heavy player, as somebody who wanted a lot of resources, but I think he's settled into a nice role of being able to be aggressive enough to generate tempo in the early game, and then utilizing that to make sure that his bot lane is in as good of a spot as possible, basically identical to what Krakow has done throughout a majority of his career. Again, I think they're basically the same player. So they're going to be happy to bring Raptor back. I think he's become a big mainstay piece for FearX. But it's the solo laners that I think give people a lot of pause and a lot of concern and really put a limit on what this team could accomplish last year. They even looked at other options internally. Saboro obviously was a big option for them. He's now over in the LPL winning the Demacia Cup with Invictus Gaming. And then they tried Daystar to come up here, but they settled on keeping their main starters in Clear and Vikla. And I just don't like this. I think this is still the big problem with this team. There's no reason to believe that this is going to get better going into 2026. Now, I will say, I think Vikla maybe gets ragged on more than he deserves, not entirely, right? I think Spring Vikla deserved every bit of negativity that he received, but he stabilized a lot. I think at the end of summer, he was a big reason why they ended up getting top 6, being able to make playoffs, and then he was actually pretty good at the Asia Invitational and ended up being important towards this team winning that tournament. So I'm not like fully out on Vikla. This guy's just massively inconsistent, and his bad games are as bad as anyone's, but I have him ranked above Fisher, who we've already talked about. I think he's a better player than someone like Fisher. I just don't think he's a good mid laner, and he certainly is somebody who limits your ability to try and play for a top 4 or top 5 role. Like, you're never going to be a world's caliber team with Vikla as your mid laner. It's just not really going to happen. He has kind of proven that he has playstyle limitations, and the consistency, especially against really good mid laners, is almost always going to be a problem. But I would say similar things about Clear on the top side. He comes in as my last ranked top laner, number 10, just as he did last year. Nothing has changed, in my opinion, about my analysis when it comes to Clear as a player. I don't really see any good traits to like. This guy consistently is losing in the 1v1 on the top side, regardless of how he ends up drafting. He's not really all that dynamic of a team fighter. He makes gigantic mental errors. It feels like focus is a massive problem with Clear, especially as games go longer. Like, there are just so many major issues for a guy that at one point was a pretty top prospect in the LCK Challengers League for DRX Challengers. He's never really been able to live up to that hype. He'll have stretches of 1 or 2 weeks where it's like, oh, has Clear activated? Has Clear figured everything out? And then he'll go another 6 weeks in a row where he's just not very good, where this team is losing games, or he's being completely ignored on the top side of the map while going minus 20 CS and Diablo's winning the game for his team. Like, it's just, it's not a good look. Like, I do not think he's a valuable top laner. I think he can survive at this level. There are weaker number 10s in different positions throughout the rest of this, video, and as we've already seen in this video, but he is not somebody that I believe in. And when both of your solo laners are upside limiters, in my opinion, and your jungler is really only there to make sure your bot lane is in a good spot, it becomes really difficult for you to ever be a genuinely competitive team near the top of the standings. I think Diablo and Kellen as a bot lane, they're more than good enough to try and compete for top 4, to try and go to Worlds. I think as a duo, they're almost certainly a top 4 bot lane in the LCK. The problem is they just don't have the talent around them on this roster, and even with the lack of changes and the inbuilt synergy that should be there at the beginning of the year, that should make them do better in Winter Split, I think the solo lane gaps between them and even some of the other teams that are around them in this tier list is just too big for me to imagine them actually making an impact and winning games consistently. I really do think that this team is kind of built to be average, and unfortunately, that's just not something I want to reward a ton in my power rankings. But then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this was a team that I kind of wanted to put at number 7 in these rankings for a very long time, but I think the good players on this team just elevate them a little too much. It's NS RedForce coming in at number 6 for me. This is a very hard team to try and establish an opinion on because there's so many unknowns, I think, coming into this year. I think basically every single one of their new players, I have no clue what they're going to play like. They have the chance to play really well. They have the chance to play really poorly. I think that there are high ceilings, low floors on basically every single player on this team. And even the two that you're bringing back, the two that really carried this team into a good position at the beginning of the year, they played terrible down the stretch when things really got hard for this team. And you're hopeful that they're going to be able to bounce back, that was all circumstance, but it's just hard to know for certain. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like KING in the top lane, Sponge in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Taeyun at AD carry, and Lehens at support. Of course, you know, KING and Lehens had to bring him back. They kind of have become the franchise players here for NS. They really wanted to go in a different direction last year, and I'm going to make a couple of jokes later on in this segment that kind of poke fun at the roster building that either this team or these players have done to surround themselves with good pieces of talent. You know, I'll even make the joke right now. Lehens and KING accidentally hit on a jungler last year, and they said, whoa, 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 we wanted the worst jungler in the league. Why, Gideon, what are you doing? You're actually performing well. That's insane. So they had to go in a different direction. But jokes aside on that, it's just been a really strange experiment. Lehens has obviously had a ton of control here for NS. They basically built entirely around him coming off of that Gen.G, year where he basically dominated the entirety of the LCK. People forget that the year before that on KT as well, he won the MVP in the summer split. I don't think a lot of people remember that this guy is a former MVP of the league, but Lehens is still the franchise player for NS. Unfortunately, the top 3 supports all were phenomenal last year, and it's really hard to say that Lehens was better than them, even if he was probably better than them at the beginning of the year when things were a lot more equal. He certainly had a harder job and performed arguably just as well as anyone in the world when it came to support play. It just fell off at the end of the year. When you have a player like this, it's just really tough to, make it work when the rest of your team is running it down. Like, his playstyle does not work on bad teams. It just kind of is the case. We saw that for many years before he ended up joining Gen.G the first time, when he was on those, like, a freak teams in the past. I remember making some jokes about that back in the day, but he is the player that's going to determine whether or not this team succeeds or fails. He's still a world-class caliber support, and it's clear that on his best day, he can carry anybody in the entire world to a good, outcome. Even Jiwoo last year had some moments at the beginning of the year because Lehens was just playing so well, but like we saw at the end of the year, if his aggressive style isn't working, he's going to go 0-10. Like, there is no middle ground when it comes to Lehens, and it's why you can never really grade him on his KDA, because there are going to be a lot of times where his KDA looks terrible, even though he had a massive impact on the game. And also, if his team is bad, his KDA is going to look bad because he's constantly going to be looking for plays. He never really gives up on a game. That can be both good and bad, but for now, it ranks him just outside of the big 3 supports in the LCK at number 4 and is the best player on this team. I also feel pretty good about KING. He actually had a really great year last year, and I think that kind of goes under the radar because the team was really bad down the stretch. He was also kind of bad down the stretch, but who wasn't? On NS, like, it's just so hard to try and evaluate that team in terms of how they ended up breaking down with, the Legend group and losing every single series, not winning a single, best of 3 over the course of the entirety of summer. It's not a great look, but KING was so good to get them there in the first place that I'm willing to say that in a good situation, he'll be fine. It's the same thing I said about Gideon. Like, just get them out of this nightmare format, nightmare situation, and get them to a spot where they can actually compete. KING to me is still a top 4 top laner. I don't really think there's anybody outside of the big 3 that are even on the same level as KING. I would say he's a full tier, just like Lehens above anybody else in that position. And he's just the same player that he was when he won Worlds, when he won World Finals MVP. Like, there's no real major difference between the way he was playing then and the way he's playing now. He can still carry. He's really aggressive. He likes AP top laners in particular, and if they want to play around him, they can. He's really good on weak side. Like, he's just a valuable piece to have. That definition of like a B+ caliber top laner, not really a game breaker because he doesn't have the mechanics, but good at everything. You feel very comfortable with him as your starting top laner. But the 3 new players on this team, that's where the conversation becomes really interesting to try to narrow down where they are at, because Sponge, Scout, and Taeyun all have major question marks for majorly different reasons. We'll start with Sponge. He's the player coming over from another LCK team, in this case DRX. He's been starting for that team for 2 years in a row, and I'll say it. He's made progress. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like, he hasn't gotten better over the course of his 2 starting years, but he started off so bad in the LCK that there really was no other place to go other than up. He was the kind of player that in year 1, like, he might have been one of the worst LCK players I've ever watched, and that's not exclusive to him on this team. We'll talk about Taeyun before he left for the LPL in just a second, but Sponge was very bad for DRX, and then last year he started to show some signs of development. He had a couple of good games, a couple of good weeks, and it's like, okay, we can see that Challengers League tape starting to come through again because he was a very good Challengers League player before he got promoted to Tier 1. The question is, like, how many leaps are there in this guy's system? Because he took a leap last year, he got better, but he went from completely unable to play in the LCK to significantly below average at the jungle position in the LCK. Like, if he has another major leap in him, potentially he could become like a slightly below average jungler, even an average jungler at this level, but it's kind of hard to predict that that's going to happen. Best case scenario, I think, for this guy is that he turns into a slightly below average jungler, and I don't like that punt. I think that there were other options. I don't know if Gideon was always going to leave this team, if that was just never going to be like a possible piece to try and return, but Gideon was so much of a better punt, and there are other LCK Challengers League junglers that I think could have been good punts. Somebody like Youngjae obviously still doesn't have an LCK roster. I think he would have been a better choice than someone like Sponge. It's just a confusing pickup, and I think if there is a massive weak link on this team, to me, it's very clearly in the jungle. I think you're going from jungle actually being a strength for this team, maybe surprisingly last year, to it now being likely another weakness. It's why I made the joke that Lehens and Kingen, struck out last year. They accidentally got a good jungler, so they wanted to rectify that situation this year by going for Sponge. And then Scout and Taeyun both coming back over from the LPL with differing, legacies. Of course, Scout, one of the most legendary LPL players of all time, won Worlds, World Finals MVP on Edward Gaming back in 2021. So this guy has done everything in LoL Esports. There's nothing else left for him to accomplish other than come back to his home region, his home country of Korea, and to try and finally finish what he started back, I want to say in like 2016, 2017 on SKT. I can't even remember when he ended up being, the promoted backup to Faker and playing a couple of games before going over to the LPL, but he's finally getting a starting spot for the first time in his entire career back in the LCK. Unfortunately for him, it's coming off of the worst year of his entire career. For those of you who did not watch the LPL last year, Scout was a nightmare. Like, he was terrible for JD Gaming. He was making massive mental errors. His mid game was maybe the worst I've ever seen out of a mid lane player, especially at a top tier level. He was just not very good. There were some bright spots, some games amidst the darkness that you could kind of look at and say, he's still in there. Like, there's still a good player in Scout that you can pull back out. But if you're just going off of 2025 tape, Scout deserves to be a lot lower in the mid lane rankings on this list than number 6. But it's Scout. And I mean, this is a guy who's only really been good throughout his entire career. Even last year, like, there were still moments that you could see that old Scout in, and you just have to hope that that is not the version of him that you are getting again in 2026. There is a chance that he is washed, but that's, fine. You have a backup option here, which is crazy to me that Calyx is still under roster here, the starting mid laner for them throughout the back end of the year. Probably the player who played the best on Nongshim when they were getting destroyed by the rest of the league in the Legend group. He's still here. He's a backup on this team, and if Scout is terrible, you can bring Calyx in and you can feel pretty good about that. He'd rank relatively similarly in these mid lane rankings, around number 6 or number 7 in terms of these rankings, so you wouldn't have to feel too bad about that, but you have to hope and pray that you can get the best version of Scout, that he's motivated to come back to Korea and to really dominate the game. As for Taeyun, very different story. Like, again, also coming over from the LPL, but basically the opposite journey, where Scout is this legendary player who's won Worlds, who's won, a World Finals MVP, who's been an MVP caliber player throughout most of his career. Taeyun was, and I'm not, being facetious when I say this, the single worst player I've ever watched in the LCK in my life. Like, I grade out players, as you guys know. I have a grading system that I track on my own as I go throughout the split when I cover every single game, and I have never graded out a player worse than Taeyun on the Guangdong Freaks. Like, there has never been an LCK player, or even like a tier 1 player, that I think played as detrimentally bad as Taeyun did in his first stint in the LCK. But he goes over to the LPL last year on Team WE, and it seems like some of the Scrim God, things that we had been hearing about Taeyun actually start to come to fruition on that roster. He's not consistent. In fact, I would say that he was bolstered by his support more than he actually improved, but he at least had a couple of good games. There were stretches of time where it felt like he got his confidence back and really started to play okay again. The problem is, like, even if that is the best version of Taeyun that we get, that's like the 7th or 8th best AD carry in the league, and I'm expecting some regression. Like, yes, he's coming back to play with Lehens, who I think is like a better version of Vampire, and Vampire was able to elevate Taeyun throughout a lot of last year, but Taeyun needs elevating. Like, this guy is just not good on his own, and if he is anything like he was in his first stint in the LCK, he's not just number 10, he's like number 15 in these rankings. Like, he's so far below being an LCK caliber player that it's really tough to imagine. Again, the floor on Taeyun, I think, is just as low as it could ever possibly go. I do not like this move. I criticized it pretty heavily in the offseason. Even if you hit, I think that's pretty against the grain. You needed an AD carry on this team, and it doesn't even really feel like you upgraded over Jiwoo. Both of them are, you know, big shots in the dark. I think Taeyun was better last year than Jiwoo was, but it's just hard to imagine that either of them felt like the number one option or the right choice for this team. So you're hopeful for Nongshim that none of that happens, but the combo of Sponge and Taeyun on this team terrifies me. Like, I cannot begin to express just how scared those two being on the same LCK roster makes me, because there's a chance that they are the two worst players in the LCK. I'd bet against that. You know, Sponge is going to be in the conversation, and I'm pretty anti-Taeyun, but I think that we saw enough last year out of Taeyun on WE, and Sponge, I think, got better. Hopefully he can take another leap this year, and with the surrounding talent, I think the core around them will elevate them to be better than some of the players we already talked about, maybe on worse teams in this list. But you are relying a lot on players that are inconsistent. Lahens even is inconsistent. He's the best player on this team, and he obviously can elevate a lot of people, but if things aren't going right, he's going to look bad. And Taeyun, not consistent. Sponge, not consistent. Scout was not consistent last year. Even Kingan started to fall off at the end of the year. There is a world where this team is significantly worse than they were last year, but I think with the talent that they brought in and just the hope that the core here is good enough to elevate everything else, like, this is probably a pretty similar team to what they were in 2025, a team that can compete and maybe even looks interesting for parts of the season, but is pretty likely not going to contend for an actual world spot. But now moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and I'll be straight up honest with you guys. This might be the team that I am the most excited about heading into 2026. I love this roster, and I'm excited to talk about them. It's Dplus KIA coming in at number 5 for me. Boy, did I want to put this team at number 4 in these rankings. Boy, did I want to say that by the end of the year, they were definitely going to Worlds and everything would work out. And while I still kind of am making that prediction, you know, no gated, I guess, opinions here. I really do think this will be a Worlds team by the end of the year. I just don't think they're going to be that day number 1. They proved me wrong last year, though. They did the opposite. They ended up being the best team in winter and, you know, looked incredible up until the playoffs, and then they never were good again. So hopefully we get the opposite arc from them in 2026. Their lineup right now is looking like Shiwoo in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Smash at AD carry, and Career at support. Of course, 3 members returning, but it's the bot lane that is brand new that gives me the most excitement when it comes to this team, because this bot lane has the potential to be absolutely killer for this team. Like they have the mechanical ability to just dominate the LCK if everything were to work out. They're both still prospects. You know, technically, you know, Smash has played quite a few games in the LCK, but they're both still prospects, and so I don't want to sit here and tell you that they're immediately going to be unbelievable. That transition can just be a little bit difficult, especially leaving the T1 system, but if there were 2 prospects that I ever felt the most confident were going to be able to make it work, it's probably these 2 in the bot lane. And I guess we can start with them, even if they aren't the best players on the team. I just am so itching to talk about them. I want to talk about them first. You guys know my thoughts on Smash. I think this guy is unbelievable. I think everything that I said about Diablo, you can basically say the same thing about Smash, except he's even more specific in the way that he carries. This is a hyper carry player. I mean, there is really no other way to say it. You want someone to play Zeri, you want someone to play Jinx, you want someone to play Aphelios. Smash is your guy. He is going to try and 1v9 every single game that he is a part of. He can play, you know, other things. He's a decent Ezreal player. You know, he can play these early game scalers if you need him to. He's not awful at things like Caitlyn, but really his bread and butter is picking whichever hyperscaler is in meta right now and just getting every resource and dominating team fights. Like, he is built in that mold. It honestly reminds me so much of what Paze looked like as a rookie. I'm not going to say that he's the exact same player as Paze. I think that they're a little bit different. Paze probably had a little bit more of a dynamic skill set, but I think Smash might be an even better carry in terms of like where he's at as a young player. He obviously has a little bit more experience than Paze had coming into the LCK, but Smash is ridiculous. His mechanics are out of control. If he can get into the right system, and if you can, you know, kind of expand his gameplay a little bit, make him a little bit better in the early game in the 2v2 lane, then he's going to be a monster, because he's already maybe the best late game team fighting AD carry like in the region. He really is that good in that phase of the game. He just needs to start expanding elsewhere. And then there's Career at support. And you know what hurts me? Putting the number 8 below Career. Boy, do I not think that that is going to age well. Like, I really do think this guy will be a top 3 or 4 support in the LCK this year, and maybe that's me calling my shot. Like, do I think he's going to be near what Lahens is as a player? probably in terms of the execution. Again, I know that feels like a massive thing to say, but that's just how highly I view Career. This guy, you know what? I said earlier, oh, I don't think Vincenzo was MVP. I think Zinni was probably MVP. Zinni was probably MVP. If they gave MVP to Career, would anyone really be all that mad? He really was that good in the Challengers League as well. One of the best support prospects I've seen come out of the Challengers League in quite some time. It's very rare that you get supports that really stand out in that kind of way. I think Wei, ironically enough, was somebody that people were excited about because of the rest of the team around him, but I was always much lower on him and certainly much lower on his current ability, as I talked about in this same video last year, and of course that aged really well, but Career might be the best support prospect out of the LCK Challengers League that I've seen in years. Like, he really is that good. He does everything at a high-end level. He's a great shot caller. He's awesome in lane. He's a good playmaker. I really think he complements Smash well. If Career's laning ability can really translate itself to, you know, helping Smash be strong in the early game, if Smash starts getting like 50 CS leads, it's over. Like, it's actually GG. That's what was happening when he was playing with KIA on T1, and he just got free laning phases and would go off for 23 kills on Zeri in games. If you can get him into similar positions, all of a sudden things become very, very dangerous for this Dplus KIA team. I know I haven't even really touched on the veterans here, but to me, this team could live or die by just how high the ceiling is for this bot lane. Like, there's a chance they're not very good, where Smash takes a step back coming out of the T1 system, and Career takes some time to adjust. I still think this team will be fine without that. They're probably still a top 5 team, even if the bot lane isn't good, but I'm just so excited about what this bot lane could be that I basically needed to talk about them first. But let's talk about the rest of the team, because it's not like they're slouches elsewhere. There's a reason that this team's floor is basically number 5 in the league. I think the mid-jungle duo still continues to be something that I'm really excited about on this team. Showmaker is still better than people give him credit for. He was awesome at the end of last year. I feel really bad because he kind of is the odd man out in the big 4 right now of the mid laners. Like, maybe you want to put him above someone like Zeka, who we will talk about a little bit later, but really he's kind of just the default number 5 guy now that BDD has really taken that next step and taken that next leap and gotten into the upper echelon. But Showmaker more than deserves to be considered one of the best mid laners in the world, and I don't think he gets talked about in that conversation enough. I continue to be a massive defender for him. He massacred the Rise group, even if his team wasn't very good, which, you know, his bot lane was running it at times, his top laner was not, you know, super consistent, all of that stuff. Like, Showmaker was still excellent in Rise group last year and was a big reason why this team was 1 series away from making the World Championship. So I still feel very good about Showmaker. He's everything he was in his prime, just kind of turned down to maybe like 85%. He's certainly not in peak form, but he's still very, very good and still one of the better mid laners in the world. And then people are still really excited about Lucid. And boy, I want to be excited about Lucid. Like, I really do. The good games still look phenomenal, and I think the process still looks pretty good from what he is in terms of a development curve. But like, it's just frustrating to look at the graph, right? Like, it's frustrating to look at the development graph of where he has been in the LCK, because he was pretty bad day number 1. I kind of called that. I was actually very vocal on this channel in the 2024 pre-primer, where I was like, I don't think Lucid's going to be very good day number 1. I think he's going to have a pretty big learning curve, and that's exactly what happened. He was pretty bad at the start of his career, started to figure things out in summer of 2024, and then really emerged at the end of summer and into playoffs as a big piece for Dplus KIA moving forward. And then the beginning of 2025, the LCK Cup, I was like, oh my god, is this guy like a top 10 player in the world? Like, he really was just dominating in winter. He looked as good as anyone could have ever anticipated, and you're talking about a guy who has only gotten better since he started in the LCK, and now all of a sudden the hype train is like completely out of control when it comes to Lucid. And I don't want to say it comes crashing down in spring and summer, it just kind of goes down a little bit. Like, he's just not as good in spring and summer. He's an average jungler at this level, which is like fine. Like, you're okay with that. It's just so unexciting that it kind of worries me a bit that he really did like peak in winter and then almost immediately regress back to basically what he was for most of the beginning of summer in 2024, where he's like a good player, but he's not like an elite player. So I hope that there's more here with Lucid. I think he has the talent and the skill set, and again, the process to get there. I think everything is kind of pointing in the direction where he still can take that leap and become one of the best junglers in the world. If that happened, I wouldn't really be all that surprised, but I feel less confident that that's going to happen now than I did last offseason, if that makes sense. I still think that there is a chance. I just think last offseason I would have given it like a 50-55%, and I think I'm probably down to like a 30% chance now, so I'm just hopeful. He comes in as number 5 for me. He's not an elite jungler right now, but he will have games where he looks like an elite jungler. He'll show you the flashes. He has everything you want out of one of the best junglers in the world. He just needs to put it together for the entirety of the year. And then there's Shiwu on the top side, and I think this is a bit of a controversial opinion, at least according to my comment section last year. I'm very much a Xiwu defender. I think this guy has a really decent skill set. I think he fits well with this team. And is he limited? Yeah, he's a decently limited player, but is he really good at the thing he's really good at? Yeah, he's also really good at that. He's like a better version of Rich, who we talked about earlier for DRX, where he's not a consistent laner, but he's a great team fighter. The reason he's so much higher and I feel so much better about him is not only because he has significantly better mechanics. I don't even think it's really all that comparable. The hands difference between Xiwu and Rich is just not even a conversation to have. But even more so than that, I think Rich can't win lane. Like, even in the right circumstances, he's just not going to generate leads for himself. Xiwu isn't a great laner, but boy, if you get him into a spot where he can like dominate, he can run games. Like, the best games for Xiwu still look tremendous, and he was excellent in some pretty pivotal moments for Dplus KIA, especially in later 5v5s. If he's going into the late game with a gold lead, he is going to trounce you, and he does that a lot more commonly than I think people give him credit for. The numbers at the end of the year aren't going to look great because his losses aren't awesome and he's not hyper consistent in the laning phase, but if he can even just take a slight jump and become like a league average top laner in terms of his laning ability, he could become one of the most valuable players in the entire league from that role. All of a sudden, he really does pretty instantly become one of the more, dominant top laners because of just how good he is in the team fighting stage, especially with resources. I think it would compound his already good skill set. So, as you can see, I'm actually pretty high on this team. I like the players. I like the way that this roster is constructed. The major question marks for me going into this year, can Xiwu take another leap, I think, in year number 2? If he can do that, if he becomes like a top 2 or top 3 top laner, which I think is in there in terms of the mechanics and the skill set that he has, and can Lucid take that next jump? I think those two things are pretty massive, but quite frankly, the floor on this team, higher than any other team that we've talked about already, because I think Showmaker will win them games. I think Lucid is still a very good jungler. Like, Xiwu is a solid enough top laner. And I think Smash has kind of proven that if you just give him a couple of resources, he is going to be able to win you games. Career is a solid enough player. I just think the upside on this team is kind of ridiculous. This is the first team in this video that I'm kind of expecting to go to Worlds, even though they're not top 4. We'll talk about the team that actually finished 4th that I think, might actually have a little bit of stuff to worry about. You can probably guess who that is, but like, the upside on this team kind of necessitates me talking about them very highly. And if I had to kind of put a thing out there, just put a little bit of a prediction out there and kind of stamp my approval on a team, I think this team is going to do better than 5th, even if that's where they are in the power rankings right now. It just might not happen day number 1. But then moving on to number 4 in my power rankings, and this is a team that just came off the best year they've ever had, internationally at the very least, in their organization's long and illustrious history, but there are a lot of reasons for concern. It's KT Rolster coming in at number 4 for me, and you know what? They should be pretty lucky to get number 4 in these rankings. I really oscillated between putting them number 4 and number 5, with Dplus KIA at 4. I just think KT is going to be better in winter, and that's what this is. Like, this is a winter power rankings video, and I think KT will be better day number 1, even if I think there are some question marks about this team. I just don't really like the construction of what they went for in the offseason. They took a team that overperformed in a massive way, had a miracle run at Worlds, and they kind of took a lot of the soul out of it. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about just why I'm really not feeling good about KT. Not that that should be a surprise to anybody on this channel. It feels like every year I come in the winter split and go, you know what, guys, I'm not feeling good about KT this year. It just seems like me and the organization are at odds in terms of our decision making, but their lineup, at least what it is looking like right now in 2026, is looking like perfect in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane aiming at AD carry, and Ghost, I believe, will be the day 1 starting support. Polu is here, the starting support for BRION, okay bro, over the last couple of years or so, but I would expect Ghost to be the one that they actually try at the start of this year, especially in the LCK Cup. It's really a format that doesn't matter all that much. You might as well give it a shot and see if he ends up being good. But, we'll talk about why I think this bot lane is not great and why I think there's some room to believe that there's some regression on the top side of the map as well. But the one player I am not concerned about, the one player that is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, is one of the best players in the world, regardless of position, is of course BDD in the mid lane. He is really not debatable anymore. He comes in as my number 2 mid laner in the LCK. Those of you who know how these mid lane rankings work should know that that's a pretty high compliment, but I honestly can't put him anywhere else. He is very clearly the number 2 mid laner right now in the LCK. I think you could, refer to him as the number 2 player in the LCK if you really wanted to go that far. He's awesome. He's shown everything that you could ever want to see out of a mid laner at this level, and I think it's the Worlds where run that really solidified everything. I mean, he was already a top 5 player in the world for me going into Worlds, but he was exceptional at Worlds. I mean, he is the reason that that team was 1 game away from winning World Finals, and he has just, he's one of the best players in the world. He's peaking right now. This is already a legendary mid laner, somebody who's had a ton of success on multiple different organizations, and he is pretty clearly the best he has ever been right now, and that's the highest compliment I could possibly give him. BDD is just ridiculous. He can do everything at a high-end level. He's a great laner, but he's specifically phenomenal at shoving and roaming. That is a skill set that is much more valuable now. I haven't really talked about a lot of the game changes on this channel, but of course the boots quest item for mid lane is really good for those shove and roam type of mid lane players, and BDD I think fits that really well. He's evolved into a player that I think is a lot more active in the early game. When you think of like Gen.G BDD, you think of a control mage player that wants to play a little bit slower, somebody who was kind of built in the same mold as like a Crown, even going back to his time on like Kingzone. Like, he was a lot slower. He was much more, you know, team fight focused. I think he's completely changed how he plays in that regard and has become a lot more unlocked in the earlier part of the game. He's become a better skirmisher. He's still one of the best team fighters in the world. He always has been one of the best team fighters in the world. It's just ridiculous how consistent he's become. And he does so with all of the pressure and responsibility in the world on his shoulders. He has to be literally everything for this team at times, and he still lives up to that hype. He is arguably the second best player in the world right now, and he's certainly in that conversation. Like, he's right up there with other players like Knight and like Ruler, I think, that need to be considered in that. But, you know, if you want to put him there, I'm not going to argue against it. To me, he's the second best mid laner in the LCK, not quite the second best player in the world, but probably top 5. As for the rest of this team, they're still good, but there are more problems, I think, outside of that. Like, BDD on his own, like, he should be competing not just to make Worlds, but to win Worlds every single year. That's the kind of talent that he is in the mid lane, and one of the big reasons I've been so critical of this organization is because they do not constantly surround him with the kind of talent that should be winning Worlds. I think bringing Cuz back was kind of necessary. Those two really developed a nice chemistry towards the end of the year, but I'd be lying if I said there isn't some risk when it comes to Cuz as a player. Not only is he kind of one-dimensional in terms of his playstyle, although he did expand on that at the end of last year. This is somebody who has been known as, I don't want to say Kanavi light over the course of his career, but somebody who is almost entirely predicated on generating early leads, pathing really aggressively, and then snowballing games out of control. That's always been Cuz's bread and butter. Last year, he was a lot better at playing the slower style. More specifically, it kind of just came out of nowhere at Worlds. He wasn't even really good at it domestically, but at Worlds, he was really good at playing that slower style. Hopefully, that's something he can translate to the LCK, because it looked fantastic. He was great at the World Championships, some of the best he's ever played in his entire career. But one of the big concerns for me is not only the playstyle problems, but also the fact that Cuz looked awful last year until Peter came in the support position. And I think a lot of people forget that. Like, through spring, like especially the beginning of spring, this guy was terrible. Like, he just was not playing well for this team. He was constantly throwing away mid games because he wasn't in the right place, and he was over aggressing and getting caught out with weird invade timings. Like, he was just making a ton of mental errors, and I think people generally forget about that because he ended the year so strong. But, you know, Ghost is coming in here without any experience ever playing support, and he's going to be asked to fill a role where Peter was super active on the map. Like, Peter's main, I guess, selling point was that he was like the #1 playmaker for basically any team in the entire league with the responsibility that he had on this team, and him and Cuz were basically a unit throughout a lot of the mid game. I don't think that's going to be the case for Cuz and Ghost, and that's where I think maybe Polu would even be better for this team in the short term. But hopefully Cuz can continue to make it work. He's made it work with other supports in the past. It was very specifically 2025 where it felt like he just did not have that synergy until Peter came in. Maybe it was just a way problem, and Ghost will be better than that. I think that is the hope, but there is some, you know, possibility, I think, for some regression here in the jungle when you look at the surrounding circumstance and the reasons why he was good last year. And then Perfect is the other player coming back. You guys know I'm a pretty big Perfect fan. I wasn't surprised at all by the fact that this guy was excellent at Worlds. I think anybody who watched him in the Challengers League would know that he was a pretty big deal. You know, I went out as far as to say at the time that Perfect was the best top lane prospect in the Challengers League in a while, and I continue to agree with that. Even watching a lot of other Challengers League top laners, I don't think prospect-wise, like in terms of just raw Challengers League tape, I don't think players like Casting or players like Shiwu or players even like Thanatos had as good of a Challengers League resume as Perfect had. had. I really do think he was that important to the team, and I think he finally kind of came into his own towards the end of last year. The problem is he's just super inconsistent. He's very mechanically talented. He can carry at the end of games, and he can win in lane, but all of this stuff is inconsistent for him, and he definitely has never been able to accomplish it for more than like a 1 month stretch of time. That's what we need to see. We need to see one full split of him just genuinely, living up to that potential rather than just one tournament or one playoff run or, a couple of weeks here or there, a couple of games every so often. Like, I just want to see the consistency start to build because I still do love Perfect, but I am kind of a little bit worried. I'm actually maybe on the other side of the coin from a guy who just was really good in a Worlds run that got them to World Finals. I don't think he has like the skill set to be a top 3 or 4 guy from what we've seen in the LCK. I really do think he's going to settle in as being like your league average type of top laner. And while that's not a negative, it's certainly not like a selling point for me. I think his value is a little bit inflated because of that Worlds run compared to what we've seen from him elsewhere in the LCK. So I'm hopeful he can take that next step because I was such a big fan of him as a prospect. I'm just not necessarily expecting that to happen in 2026. I think he'll play very similar to how he did for most of 2025. And then the bot lane, like, how can I be excited about this bot lane? I'm sorry for being so pessimistic, but it's aiming and Ghost. Like, I'm just not excited about this. And KT fans out there might be mad at that. And honestly, if you disagree, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear why people might be excited about an aiming Ghost or aiming Polu bot lane for this team. But, like, is this even better than Doctum and Peter? Like, I don't even think this is better. Aiming is almost certainly better than Doctum. He ranks 1 spot above him, but they're kind of the same player. Aiming has a much more specialized skill set. He's kind of built in that Teddy mold, as I always talk about. He's a great team fighter, but he's really passive in the early game. He basically does nothing except for farm. But if you do get to the late game with him as your primary carry, he's going to be one of the more consistent 5v5 team fighters in the world. He's just not a very exciting player, and he's certainly not someone that you want to put like your team on the back of. We've seen basically when he is the #1 option, which he won't have to be here because they have BDD, but when he is like close to the #1 option, he's basically never good enough to actually make a team good. You want him to be a secondary carry on a team if they are going to be competitive. I think he can fill that void here, but he's no longer in the conversation for being a superstar ADC. I've always been a lot lower on aiming. Again, I think it's the specialized skill set. I think it's the, every point being invested into the late game. It's not like someone like Smash who has the mechanics to break out of that. Like, aiming just doesn't have the mentality to ever play aggressive because he's not very aggressive. And so, I think there's just a little bit of a ceiling, a limit on what aiming can be. And then you've got Ghost, I believe, coming in here as the starting support. It looks like he will be starting day #1. This guy's never played support competitively. Hope he's good. Like, you know what I mean? There's just nothing else I can say here. When you look at Ghost's skill set, of course, like you go, oh, weak side AD carry king, arguably the best weak side AD carry of all time when he was playing for Damwon. You look at that and you go, yeah, that can translate well to support. He was always a good laner. He was somebody that, made smart macro rotations and was very good at sacrificing resources and being there for skirmishes. Those are all valuable traits for a support. But like, the problem is when you watch KT Rolster last year, support is not a role that they can hide on this team. Like, you don't have players that want to hide behind support. Peter was the primary playmaker for KT Rolster in 2025. He was the player that was setting up a lot of their engages. And if Ghost is going to be given that responsibility from day #1, expect some speed bumps. Like, that's all I can really say. Expect some problems for this team if that is going to be like a little bit of an issue for them, because I just have no clue what he's going to look like. We see a lot of people out there, and I said this in the offseason grades video, I will reiterate it here. You see a lot of people being like, well, Ghost, you can't call this offseason bad because Ghost could be a good support. And I just think that undercuts process by like such a ridiculous amount, because you're not OK BRION, you're not DRX, you're not even like a BNK FearX. You are coming off of a World Finals appearance. You have a top 5 player in the world, and you just signed a support who's never played the position before, who was playing in tier 2 of Latin America last year. He's playing in the Latin American League, trying to get into North America last year. Like, that is the player that you signed to play with the top 5 player in the world. It's just ridiculous process. Now, if this is Polu, I think the floor is much higher. Polu's not a great player. Like, he doesn't really have a great skill set, but at least he's shown the ability to be a playmaker at the LCK level. I think he's a below average support, but Ghost's floor is much lower than below average support. I think that there is a chance that Ghost is bad. I think a skill set likely will translate, but I think that there could be some problems day #1 as well. The thing that is salvaging this ranking, because I've been so negative about KT Rolster in this segment, is that they have BDD, and even Cuz, right? Like, Cuz Buzz is salvaging this. There's just, you can only be so bad when you have that good of a player on your roster. He is good enough to make basically any roster a Worlds contender, and that's just the credit that I give BDD. I don't really like the process outside of it. I think the bot lane's not going to be very good. I could see some regression both from top and jungle going into 2026, but if BDD is still one of the best players in the world, this team is going to be a Worlds team, and they are going to be a threat to even be better than that in these rankings. But now we're moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is the leap, isn't it? You know, the top 3 in the LCK right now just feel a lot better than everybody else, and maybe one of these teams really underperforms, but feels like there's a big 3 certainly, and unfortunately coming in at the bottom of that big 3 for me, it is going to be Hanwha Life Esports at number 3 in my power rankings. I still really, really like this team. I want to make it clear, it is a big 3 in the LCK. I just think the other 2 teams I feel a little bit better about right now than HLE. You know, we kind of saw that at Worlds. T1 obviously going and winning their 3-peat, and Gen.G, you know, whatever. It's Worlds, you know, we'll talk about it. Trust me, we'll get to that section of the video. But HLE, while they've been very good, they just can't quite get over the hump right now in terms of, you know, international success. They're hoping that with 2 new additions to this team and hopefully some rebounding performances from last year, they can get a little bit closer. Their lineup is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Delight at support. I'm actually going to kind of go a bit out of order here, and I'm going to start with the one player that I feel the worst about on this team, and it's because I think this really is the narrative for HLE for me. Like, we can talk about, oh, Gumayushi's coming over, but he's going to be fine. He's going to perform really well. He's, you know, really peaking. Honestly, I think he's never played better than he did at the end of last year, and, you know, there were times in 2024 where I was saying very similar things. I think this guy has, you know, still consistently gotten better over the course of his career, and I don't really see any reason for that to either go down or to stop here on Hanwha Life. I think the surrounding core is good, and of course, you guys know I love Kanavi. We will get to these 2 and talk about them in just a moment, but the reality of the situation is that this team's success when it comes to trying to win the LCK, win an international tournament, you know, perform well at MSI or Worlds. I know they won First Stand last year, but doesn't really seem like anyone cares about First Stand, so I'm talking like really compete at these major international tournaments. The barrier will be, can Zeka get back to himself? Like, can he get back into the Zeka form that he had been in for, you know, basically 3 straight years for DRX and for HLE from 2022 to 2024? Are you going to get that back? Because something in Zeka broke last year. Something kind of stopped, like something in his brain stopped clicking at the end of spring. You know, I talked about it pretty religiously on the channel in 2025, but for those of you who might be tuning in for the first time, we can go ahead and recount it. He was on his traditionally great pace. He was a top 2 mid laner in the LCK, as he had been for quite a long time, despite what all the haters would tell you. And then all of a sudden, he goes up into that series against Gen.G to try to qualify for MSI. They go up 2-0, and they shit the bed for 3 straight games. They get reverse swept. Gen.G goes as the champions from the LCK as the #1 seed to MSI, and Zeka is the reason they lose that series. He is astronomically terrible in those final 3 games to get reverse swept, and it's like, oh, that's weird. Zeka's kind of a big game performer. It's weird for him to perform so poorly in such a big moment. And then they go up against T1 in that final series to qualify for MSI, and he once again gets trounced, this time by Faker and by T1, and it's like, oh, weird. Zeka just had probably the 2 worst series he's ever played as a player, and they came in some pretty big moments. Hopefully he can figure things out. They're not going to MSI. They need to figure things out going into summer. And from that moment on, Zeka was a completely different player. Like, he stopped being the Zeka that we had seen that was dynamic and explosive and was generating leads and was winning mid-game skirmishes, and he just started being a really passive player. He looked like somebody who had his mental kind of destroyed in those instances. I have no clue what switch flipped in his mind in that series, but even if you weren't a Zeka fan, right? Like, even if you were somebody that, you know, criticized his lack of consistency and, you know, wanted to, you know, fictitiously make up that he had a really small champion pool, which obviously is a bit of a dig for me, but like, even if you were kind of a Zeka hater, you can also say there is a difference between Zeka losing because he's trying too hard and playing too aggressive and, you know, trying to outskill his opponents and causing problems for his team, versus Zeka losing in the second half of last year because he's just not doing anything on the Rift. Like, it felt like a completely different player at the end of last year, and that is the difference for me. The reason that this team is not anywhere close to top 2 in terms of my projections right now is because I just don't trust Zeka to be that guy. If he can turn it back around, if he can become a top 2, top 3, even really just be like a really strong mid laner again, yeah, this team's gonna be as good as anyone else in the entire world. That was the big difference last year, but he was not that guy, and he needs to get back there. My first official channel darling back in 2022 when he was on DRX, I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to turn it around, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned and that he wasn't the reason that this team was number 3 and not number 1 or number 2 on this list. But everybody else on this team has plenty of reasons to be excited for. You have plenty of reasons to be excited for the rest of this team, I guess is the way I probably should have worded that. 2 players returning outside of Zeka, Zeus on the top side and Delight in the support position. Both of them performed at times like the best players in their positions in the world. Last year, Zeus kind of looked like the best top laner in the world through spring, but wasn't really able to carry it through to summer. Keen was a little bit better in the summer split, so Zeus gets that number 2 ranking, but he's still an incredibly aggressive top laner. He will lose you a couple of games every once in a while, but he's more consistent than he was on T1. Talked about a lot for HLE last year. His consistency was actually very high, very good laner, very good team fighter. He's Zeus. He's one of the best players in the world when he's on. You just need to get a little bit of that inting syndrome out of him because he'll make a couple of mental mistakes every single game that you just want to clean up. He never cleaned it up on T1. No reason to believe he's going to clean it up here, but it's really the only thing that keeps him out of being in like those top 5 player in the world conversations. And then there's Delight in the support position, and quite frankly, for most of last year, he was the best support in the world. And I will stand by that opinion, getting through winter, getting through spring. Not only was he the best support in the world, he was like hard carrying Hanwha Life in a lot of instances that he was not getting credit for. You want to talk about the LCK Cup and what we're kind of predicting here. Delight was not only the best player in the LCK Cup, he was the only player for Hanwha Life that was consistently good throughout that entire playoff run, and there were times where he dragged them to first stand, an international tournament that they won, mind you. So I want to give Delight a lot of credit because it just felt like he was kind of emerging as one of the best players in the world. He performed pretty similarly in spring, was still an absolute beast, and then summer was fine. He was good in summer. I don't think he was the best support in the world or anything like that, but he's still in that conversation. Unfortunately, he does fall down to number 3 for me. I think the top 2 just outperformed him at the end of the year, but Delight is not far off. As you guys know from my grades video, him, Duro, and KIA are all basically similar in grades. They're the 3 best supports in the world right now, and you can basically put them in whatever order you want. But then the 2 new players, Kanavi and Gumayushi, coming over. Guma, I feel easier to talk about. I've already basically kind of summarized him up. This is a guy for T1 that kind of blended into the background during the beginning of their dynasty when he was kind of, coming in and really becoming the face of the bot lane franchise for them as this big prospect. He was never really the one that they relied on. In fact, he played weak side more than almost any other top tier AD carry in the world for a majority of the beginning of this run, like 2022 and 2023. And then kind of a switch flipped in 2024 where the team wasn't playing well. Faker had to take some time off for injury reasons, so Poby came in. Owner was really struggling without Faker, and they needed someone to step up and carry games. And Gumayushi was arguably the most valuable AD carry in the world in the back half of 2024, really elevated that team, carried them to the World Championships, and obviously they end up winning World Finals. When Faker comes back, they end up being better, and Guma can kind of return to his more weak side role, but he showed in that limited amount of time that he could be an MVP caliber player if given the resources. And then last year, it was just like, we don't have a reason to play for bot lane, we're just going to in the summer split when things aren't going as well, when Guma gets reinserted after Smash gets full-time benched in the summer split, and all Guma and KIA do is become the best bot lane duo in the world for basically the entirety of summer, and Guma is a huge part of that. This guy is a true, like, superstar type of carry if you can get him into the right position. I would say last year was his most productive year as a player. I called his World Finals MVP, and I feel pretty proud of that, but I think that there is some risk bringing him over. This is obviously somebody who has a great skill set, can play strong side or weak side, can, primary carry, but he's never played outside of the T1 system, and you have to hope that he's going to be able to make it work. We've seen some players not be able to make that transition, but honestly, this Hanwha Life ecosystem is really good for helping players from top teams be able to integrate. We saw that with Zeus last year on T1. Delight coming over from Gen.G integrated pretty fast for Hanwha Life. I have no concerns here. I think Gumayushi is still going to be one of the best AD carries in the world. The way I've always put it, and the player I've always compared him to is Gala over in the LPL, but the reality is that, like, Gala is like 85% of what Gumayushi is. Guma is a top 2 or 3 AD carry in the world right now, and it's, I think he's playing the best he ever has, and I hope he's going to be able to keep it up. And then for Kanavi, you guys know I'm a huge fan of Kanavi. He is the best early game jungler of all time. There really is no debate on that. Nobody has been able to generate resources as consistently as Kanavi has been able to do throughout his career in the LPL, but just like Scout, as we talked about earlier, he finally now gets to return home to Korea. He finally gets to play in the LCK for the first time, of course being a product of the Griffin system, but never got to play in the LCK. So I'm sure he's very excited to see what ends up happening. I'm sure he's like really pumped to get this opportunity, and I think his skill set fits really well on this team. Like I said, he's kind of that early game spark plug. He's not always the most consistent in team fights at the end of games, but you want someone to win early, generate resources, and skirmish very aggressively. Kanavi is that guy. He was the best jungler in the LPL last year. He's one of the most historically successful junglers in LPL history, and I think this is a really good playstyle addition if Zeka is going to get back to those aggressive ways. But that's really what this all comes down to when it comes to Hanwha Life. Can Zeka get back to where he was? Because even with everything else, like this team is top 3, even if Zeka is what he was last year. But if they want to be top 1 or top 2, if they want to compete to win Worlds and to win the LCK and to be, you know, the best team in the world, that Zeka Kanavi duo can get there with that kind of aggression. We could see gold leads like nigh unforeseen in terms of what this team could generate with the kind of mechanical talent and skill sets that they have on their roster. They have some ridiculously good early game players and laners, and that could really be a big problem for other teams to deal with. Not that they don't have good team fighters, just that this could be a real problem for other teams to go through if Zeka gets back to that aggressive style. I think the bot lane's going to be great. I trust top lane. I think jungle will integrate well, but this team really has the potential to be completely game wrecking. It's just one piece away from really being right up there with the best teams in the world. But that's going to bring us to my top 2 in my power rankings heading into 2026. And you guys probably know the order because you've probably watched this channel before, but this was a very, very close call. I think you could really go either way with this one. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be T1. It is going to be the defending world champions, the defending Kespa Cup champions as of a couple of weeks ago. The team that needs no introduction, it's T1. It's the face of League of Legends. And once again, they're going to come in number 2 in my power rankings. People always get upset when coming off of a world championship that I don't have T1 at number 1. But let me ask you this. Is this a world's ranking? No, this is an LCK ranking. And you know what T1's not been very good at over the past couple of years? Winning the LCK. And unfortunately, even with a roster as good as they have right now, I still think that they are not quite favorites to win the LCK. I love their offseason move of bringing in Paze as their new AD carry if they were going to lose Guma, or even if they wanted to make this decision. I certainly have no qualms against it. I think Paze is a fantastic fit for what T1 want to do, and the rest of this roster is obviously phenomenal. So you feel pretty good about this team going into 2026, and they showed everything they needed to show in a tournament that proved at least a little bit. I'm not a big fan of Kespa Cup. It's not been a great example over the past couple of years, but certainly, you know, them winning it and beating HLE in 5 games, I think, kind of put the icing on the cake. So let's get into it. Their lineup is looking like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Paze at AD carry, and Keria at support. Obviously, only one new change here, and that's Paze coming in as the AD carry. Everything else is exactly what you know and love of T1. They really are going to play, I would say, a decently similar style, but if you want a play style expectation for what you can expect out of T1, think of how they played when Smash was playing for them last year. I think Paze coming in kind of gives them that same idea, except Paze is a much more established and much more guaranteed type of player. He's not the most aggressive 2v2 player in the world. He's either going to play weak side, or they are just going to play hyper carries down on the bottom side, and they're really going to try and utilize this new extra item slot to get Paze into a spot where he can hyper carry a lot of games. I would kind of bet that that's going to be the main way that this team ends up piloting themselves early on in the year. One thing that you can always say about T1 is that when they do integrate a new player into their team, oftentimes, especially at the beginning of their tenure, they become the main character of the team. They really want to try to get these players acclimated and comfortable in the T1 system, and so they have enough good players to adapt around them. I think Paze will kind of be the main character for them at the beginning of the year, and like I've said before, Paze is a hyper carry player. I think he's the best Zeri of all time. You know, that champion came out at a perfect time for Paze as a rookie to really start to take over, and I don't think anyone has ever played Zeri quite like Paze has been able to play her. But I've seen a lot of comments in the offseason, and, you know, people kind of disputed this in the comment section of my video, which I was really confused about. I guess we're just on different sides of Twitter and on the internet right now, but I saw a lot of people being like, oh, Paze, like the guy who got carried by Gen.G, and it just makes me question if we're watching the same games. First and foremost, this guy was a multiple-time MVP for me in the LCK. Even when he was playing for Gen.G, I thought he was just as much a part of why that team was as good as they were as anybody else was, as Chovy or as, you know, Canyon or Peanut, whoever he was playing with at the time. So I still feel pretty good about Pays obviously coming in off of that alone, but there seems to be some confusion about what last year looked like for Pays on JD Gaming, and I'll make it as simple as I possibly can. That team was a nightmare, except for the fact that Pays was trying to 1v9 every single game as an AD carry player. It's tough to do that in that role. It's tough to be the only player on the Rift who's playing well. Ask Diablo for FearX on how competitive they were capable of being, but Pays was excellent for JDG, and really the only times he played bad were way later in the season by the time his mental was probably already entirely broken by JDG. I think coming back here to T1, his mechanics are maybe the best in the entire world of any AD carry. Like, I truly mean the upside of this guy is limitless. You know, potential grades are, you know, whatever you want them to be. This guy is A+ potential. He has 99 potential. If that's how you really want to organize it, he could turn into anything in terms of the skill set that he has. The way that he's utilized that to translate into good play in the past is becoming such a good late game hyperscaler, but he was a really good laner last year in the LPL, and I think there's reason to believe that that can translate now with KIA as his support, of course, one of the best laning supports of all time. So feel very good about Pays, and I expect him to kind of be the main character of T1 early on in the season, because that's just kind of what they do with new players to get them acclimated. KIA, of course, helps. He's the best support in the world. He comes in #1 for me in the support grades. Nobody who watched last year is going to be surprised by that. I put this guy as #3 on my top 10 or top 20 players at Worlds list, and people didn't really like that at the time. What is there not to like about KIA's 2025? Like, genuinely, like, what am I missing something? Like, he wasn't great in spring. Like, you can talk about how he probably could have been better, but you know, the bot lane situation was all very strange, and he made Smash look like $1 million when he came in and, you know, started playing really well as a rookie. I essentially think they're just getting a better version of what they had last year in Smash with Pays, and KIA was exceptionally good at playing this like facilitator role. Like, he's obviously a great playmaker. You don't want to give him things like Nico or Rakan or, you know, any of his signature picks like Bard, obviously, but he can just sit there and play, you know, enablers. He can play your Nautiluses and your Leonas and just make sure that his AD carry is in as good of a spot as possible. And he can still do that better than almost any other support in the world. And so I think this fit here is really good. I think it will make Pays' transition back to the LCK as simplistic and as easy as it could ever possibly be. And KIA's skill set just translates really nicely to, I think, having a hyper carry as an ADC. Not that he can't work with anybody else. He's just kind of the jack of all trades, master of all type of support that you would love to have in any circumstance. And the other player ranked #1 in their role for me, it's going to be Owner in the jungle. And I never thought I'd get here on Owner. I never thought I'd get to the point where I really do believe he's the best jungler in the LCK and maybe the best jungler in the world. But here we are. Like, he really was that good for most of last year. Now, I do think there were some problems. This guy still is a little bit more flippy than he gets credit for. It's just kind of the nature of the jungle position. He's going to go through stretches where he's not the most dominant player in the entire universe, where he has a couple of bad games every once in a while. It was the reason that I didn't put him top 3 or top 4 in terms of my jungle rankings going into Worlds. But on the flip side of that, when he is clicking, he's probably the best jungler in the world at this point. I think he has consistently gotten better over the past couple of years, and I think 2025 was the best year of his career. So hopeful that he's going to be able to maintain that. The jungle position is stacked as always with players like Canyon and now Kanavi right on his heels. Owner is going to have some competition for that #1 spot, but at least going into 2026, he holds the top of the position for me in January. But it's the rest of the team that is not a question mark for me, but it's more of like, okay, yeah, the solo laners are not always the most dominant domestically, and that kind of has kept them out of conversations for being LCK champions. Everybody knows about Doran, right? Like, you don't need me to tell you who Doran is as a player. We've talked multiple times about other players in this video that aren't the most consistent laners, but are great team fighters. Doran takes that kind of to the extreme, where he's a good laner, especially if left isolated, but he's super susceptible to ganks and to dives. He's always been a player that doesn't particularly care if he dies in the early game. He feels like he's going to be comfortable generating resources no matter what, and so teams do exploit him. Teams target top lane against T1 in the early game and they get resources off of him. But we know that, quite frankly, I don't think there's a top laner in the world that has as much consistent success from behind as Doran. Like, he might be the best top laner I've ever watched at playing from a losing game state, because this guy will be down 50 CS, down like 700 gold on his top lane opponent, and then he'll make the one play in a team fight that ends up winning his team the game, and it's just ridiculous how consistently that happened over the past year. Do I think that's the most consistent style in the world? No. He's not on the same level as a Keen or a Zeus, as we just talked about, but is he pretty clearly the 3rd best top laner in the LCK? Right now, for me, the answer to that is yes. I would still have Doran over someone like Kingen, despite me really liking Kingen as a player. And for all the T1 fans that are constantly calling for Doran's head, I just don't think there are a lot of upgrades out there. Is he a little bit more specialized than maybe what you had in Zeus? Yeah, he's not as mechanically talented, but he is very smart, and despite how, down he'll go in gold, he will make something happen in the later part of the game, which is, kind of the T1 special if you really want to think about it that way. And then for Faker, this is the easier conversation to have, if we're being quite frank. Like, I love Faker. He's awesome at Worlds every year. He had a couple of problems at Worlds this year. Don't watch the Swiss stage. He was kind of bad in the Swiss stage, I'm going to be entirely honest, but he ended things really strong in the 2-2 and then was great in the bracket stage, so I'm not going to sit here and, like, you know, lambast Faker or anything like that. But domestically, he's just never going to be an elite player again. It's clear he saves a lot of his power, a lot of his attention, and a lot of his best games for international tournaments. And you know what? I don't blame him. He's a back-to-back a three-peat champion. This guy is obviously the best player in League of Legends history. He's, you know, the most accomplished. He's won more titles than I could ever even imagine. I think I saw a stat like during Worlds time or around World Finals where it's like Faker has been involved in more World Finals than he hasn't been, which is just absurd, right? Like, just from a baseline perspective, that's an insane thing to say, but from a domestic perspective, he's going to be a good mid laner who's going to have some bad games. The big thing about Faker domestically that he really struggles with is there are going to be some times in the mid game where he just is not respectful of his opponents, where he's stepping up in positions where he shouldn't and just dying and, you know, kind of getting, you know, numbers checked a little bit or like attention span checked. I don't think that that's a huge problem with Faker. Perhaps he's just limit testing in the regular season, so he knows what he needs to do in bigger moments, but he'll just have these moments randomly in the regular season where he makes a really bad decision in the mid game. He'll be fine. Like, for the most part, he's very valuable to T1. He's just not always, he's never probably going to be an MVP again. If he is, it's going to be a pretty big surprise to me, but just not really a domestic king. Saves a lot of his best games for internationals, MSI, and Worlds. So he comes in as my number 3 mid laner from a domestic perspective. Sorry, man, you're behind Chovy and BDD. I don't think it's the worst company to be involved in, but overall for T1, they're very complete. I think FaZe might even make their roster better in terms of the way that they're constructed, because it gives them an even clearer win condition, and they played for Guma so much last year anyways that having somebody who's even more adept at carrying in the late game in the 5v5s might even be better for this team from a skill set perspective, and you're hoping that you get more integration from players like Doran and Faker than you got domestically last year. They absolutely can win the LCK, they just haven't in recent years. I hope they can break the spell, because T1's been able to do literally everything else, but, you know, right now, unfortunately, they're just going to come in slightly below number 1 at number 2. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my power rankings heading into the LCK Cup in 2026. And there's only one team remaining. You guys know who it is. It's Gen.G coming in at number 1 for me. How could it possibly be anyone else? This team has dominated domestic play for years and years in a row now, basically regardless of who has been on the roster. It's been Chovy and then anyone else, and they've been able to win the league over and over again. So, you know, there's no reason to believe that they should be anything other than favorites heading into 2026. And that's not even really something I said going into last year. I thought this team was going to have some struggles, some learning curves, if you will, in 2025, and they didn't really. I mean, they had some problems, right? In the LCK Cup, they needed to go on a miracle run. They almost got knocked out by Nongshim in the lower bracket and then make their way to finals, but they were a top 2 team in winter, and then they go undefeated in spring, and they dominate summer, and once again, they just can't do it at Worlds. But this is not a Worlds ranking, this is an LCK ranking, and let me promise you, nobody is more adept and more consistent at dominating the LCK than Chovy. There is just no other way to put it. There has never been a player that has been better domestically in the LCK than Chovy. It is just not arguable at this point. He is on the best domestic run of any LCK player of all time. He's ranking as my number 1 mid laner. He's the number 1 player in the LCK domestically. I know people don't like Chovy and they say that he's boosted and they talk about playstyle deficiencies. You guys know I don't agree with any of that stuff. He's the best player in the world, and I don't really care that he hasn't won Worlds. It's something that I continue to not care about. This past year in the semifinals was really the first time that it felt like he actually let a lot of the pressure get to him. It felt like in previous years it had just kind of been a mixture of circumstances. His teams had just not really been able to get past some other great teams that had gone on to win Worlds. This was the first year where it's like, all right, man, you should not be losing to KT Rolster, and it kind of is your fault. BDD completely gapped you, but let's not forget how we got there in the first place, because a lot of people are going to have BDD as their number 1 mid laner heading into the LCK this year. Let's not forget that the reason, you know, Gen.G and Chovy were going as the number 1 seed in the first place was because Chovy omega destroyed BDD in the playoffs, and so it just is what it is. This guy is the number 1 domestic player in the LCK. You can't really bet on anyone playing better than what he does consistently in the LCK, and If you have a problem with that, I'm sorry. Like, you either are on the Chovy train and you kind of hear what I'm saying, or you don't, and there's not really a ton I can do to change people's minds. So he does everything at a high-end level. He's the best shove and roamer in the world. He's probably the best team-fighting mid laner in the world, although I think that there are, there's more competition, I would say, for that award, but he's certainly the best laner of any position in the world. Like, he's just really good at everything. It's Chovy, man. Like, you either think he's great or you don't, and there's nothing I can say that will change your mind. But it's the rest of this roster that makes them so dominant and so heavily favored. Of course, they're returning all 5 members from last year. Ruler and Duro really found their stride at the end of last year, if you're not counting the semifinals, because as much as Chovy deserves to get a lot of hate for that semifinals, man, was Ruler awful against KT Rolster. Boy, was he completely outplayed by Doctum, which is just not acceptable. I'm still going to lean on the side of Ruler. I'm a big fan of Ruler. I think he's the greatest AD carry of all time. As I've said on multiple occasions, he's still the #1 AD carry in the world for me. But I don't think it's like as astronomical of a gap as there is between Chovy and the other mid laners for me. I think Ruler could be dethroned. There are some inconsistencies to his game, but man, he was awesome throughout all of last year, and there's a reason why everybody had him in their top 5 going into Worlds, so still feel very good about Ruler. I still think he's the best AD carry in the world, so he's coming in at #1 for me. And then there's Duro. Duro's a hard player to try to evaluate because I want to try and understand that he's on a team with a lot of great players, but man, you watch him play, and yeah, like a lot of the biggest fans are right. He was like a huge reason this team was so dominant in the LCK last year. His playmaking abilities have really come to fruition. I'm going to take a little bit of a victory lap because we're almost 2 hours into this video, and if you're still here, then you're probably a fan, but man, I called this. Like, I don't think anybody in the universe was higher on Duro than I was when he was playing for FearX. Like, I made this guy an all-pro. This guy played like 8 games, and I made him an all-pro for FearX. 3rd team All-Pro in 2024. When he got signed by Gen.G, I knew he was going to be a superstar. It's obvious that he has all the traits necessary, and he's already blossomed into one of the best supports in the world. Of course, he has a really easy, situation around him to be able to dominate in. I think a lot of players would look really good if they got to play with Ruler and Chovy and Canyon and Keen, but Duro, I think, was not just part of the team. He was an enabler for the team last year. He's a great playmaker. He's probably the best tank engage player in the world right now in terms of the support position, and can do a little bit of everything. Can play enchanters, too, if you really need him to do that. He did that on FearX before he ended up joining Gen.G. So the bot lane still continues to be the best in the world, in my opinion. And we'll get to Canyon last. We'll talk about Keen on the top side. I think it's pretty clear that at least going into 2026, he's the best top laner in the world. You guys know how I feel about top lane. I just don't think the game breakers are in the top lane position right now, but Keen is about as close as it gets. This guy dominates top lane in the 1v1s more so than anybody else in the world consistently, and he's a great team fighter. I mean, Keen is really cementing himself as one of the best top laners of all time right now. Like, he's starting to enter the GOAT conversation of that position with how open it can be with players like Khan, players like Smeb, whoever else you want to put in the conversation. Bin, I think, deserves to be in that conversation as well, but Keen is very much just as much a part of that conversation as anybody right now, and he's still the best top laner in the world for me. And then there's Canyon, who I've become probably the biggest defender of on the internet. I'm sorry, man. I know that the comment section doesn't agree with me, and it's clear that we're just not going to be on the same page. Canyon was really good last year, and I don't care what people say. I went back and rewatched so many of their games. Like, is this guy aggressive, and is he going to make a couple of mistakes? Yes. Like, every jungler that you guys defend makes a ton of mistakes. It's the nature of the position. I cannot feasibly imagine, and I get so many comments about this, and it just makes me laugh so much, and I'm sorry for targeting my own comment section, but the top 20 players at Worlds video still stands in my mind in terms of that comment section. I cannot feasibly imagine somebody being like, how could you possibly put Canyon below Owner and Tarzan and say that as if they're like completely different players, just pretending like Owner and Tarzan don't have the same negatives that Canyon has. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and say that Canyon's above Owner. I have Owner above Canyon for a reason. I think Owner was better than Canyon last year, but to say that they're not in the same vicinity, and especially to be like, oh, you're stupid for not putting Tarzan above Canyon because Canyon was super inconsistent and lost Gen.G games. Does anyone watch these games? Like, am I the only one who sees that, yeah, Owner's gonna lose his team games, and Tarzan lost his team a ton of games last year? It happens, man. It's the nature of the position in jungle right now. You just have to take more risks, and Canyon takes more risks than your average jungler, but when they work, they dominate. And it's this idea that, oh, he lost games for Gen.G. What games? Point them to me. Show me the games that Canyon lost. I promise I will change my opinion if you can just give me an example of a game instead of this ubiquitous idea of, oh, Canyon lost games for the team. Again, show me the games because I didn't see them. I rewatched almost every Gen.G loss from last year because I was so perplexed by so many comments, and I'm just not seeing it. I believe in Canyon. Again, the Feast or Famine style is going to be pretty flippy. He's not great at tanks, but he's the best carry jungle player in the world. He's really great at generating resources, and for the most part, he plays off of Chovy incredibly well. There's no weakness domestically to Gen.G. The only weakness that they have is the fact that they can't get out of their own head internationally. Like, that is the only problem that this team has. Domestically speaking, they don't really have a flaw. They don't have a place that needs to be exploited, a weak spot that you can take advantage of. These are 5 of the best players in the world, and they're one of the best teams in the world in terms of how they play the map as well. Gen.G shouldn't be anything other than #1 in everybody's power rankings, and I'm hopeful that they can keep up their momentum from last year. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2026 LCK Cup Primer and Power Rankings video. All 10 teams ranked, all 10 teams analyzed. And now we just get ready for the LCK. It starts up in just a couple of days, about a day and a half here as this video is going live, and I cannot wait for the beginning of the LCK year. If you guys are excited, let me know in the comments. What are you excited about? What are you excited for? What teams are you interested in following? What teams do you think I over or underrated? What players do you think I over or underrated? Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below. As you guys know, I'm going to be covering the LCK every single week on this channel, as we have done for the past 4 years. This will be our 5th year in a row covering every single game of the LCK. So if you're excited for that, hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. Of course, we've got other primers coming out. We already did the LPL one, but we've got the LCS and the LEC primers coming out in just a little bit. The LEC primer is later this week and the LCS primer is next week. So get really excited for that. We're covering those leagues every single game. In the links in the description, you can see the LPL English links as well. The Twitch, the YouTube, I am a color caster for LPL English right now, and you can check out the links there if you want to, see me talk about League of Legends live or just want to tune in to some LPL broadcasts. I cannot stress enough just how hard the team there is working, so I highly recommend you go subscribe or follow depending on your platform down in the comments section, or the description below, I guess I should say. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all